Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So, before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. It was an ordinary day. My family and I had been planning this trip for weeks. A simple walk to the beach, a well-deserved break away from the daily routine. The kids, as always, were excited about the idea of seeing the sea. My wife and I, on the other hand, were looking to disconnect, to get away from the daily hustle and bustle of the city. But what I thought would be a perfect day turned into hell. The rain started to fall just as we left the house. At first, it was just a light drizzle that didn't even disturb the rhythm of traffic. However, as we drove down the road, the rain became more intense. The sound of the drops hitting the windshield became deafening. It seemed as if the sky had overflowed, unloading its fury on us. The landscape, once full of bright colors and clear skies, now looked like a somber gray mural. My wife looked out the window with an absent expression. Sometimes I thought she had this ability to read the air, to sense the weather and the tensions that accompany it. The children, as always, slept peacefully in their back seats, oblivious to the stresses of the adult world. I watched them through the rearview mirror and felt a strange peace at the sight of them. But that peace was short-lived, because something was not right. There was something in the air that made me uncomfortable. The traffic began to slow down, the streets emptying out as we moved into a more secluded stretch of road. The rain was still coming down hard, and visibility was getting less and less. It was then that the first sign that something was wrong appeared. A car in front of us slammed on the brakes. I wasn't sure why, but something told me it wasn't normal. The vehicle in front of us didn't stop for a traffic light, nor for a visible obstacle in the road. It simply braked as if it had seen something we couldn't see. My instinct told me I should slow down, but it was too late. Without warning, a pickup truck stopped in front of us, blocking the road. My heart raced immediately. I didn't understand why I had done it, but my body reacted in a way I couldn't control. I looked at my wife. Her eyes, which had been distracted looking out the window before, were now fixed straight ahead, and I knew she felt the same way too. Something was not right. Two figures descended from the van. In the middle of the rain, everything seemed blurry, but I couldn't help noticing the way their bodies moved with precision, as if they were executing a plan they already knew in advance. It was not the first time they had committed such an act. Of that I was sure. The way they advanced towards our car with that eerie calmness made my blood run cold. The man walking closest to me was tall, stout-bodied, with a gaze so cold that I couldn't help but wonder what kind of human being was capable of showing such utter indifference to life. The other man, thinner and with an equally menacing presence, moved toward the back of the car, where the children were. I could not see them, but I knew they were there, asleep, oblivious to the danger ahead. I felt a knot in my stomach, a mixture of helplessness and fear. We didn't know what they wanted, but something told me that if we didn't cooperate, the consequences would be fatal. The air inside the car grew thicker with each passing second. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, creating an almost apotheosis-like sound that somehow amplified the tension of the situation. Nothing was moving. Nothing could be heard, except the rumbling of thunder coming from far away. The storm seemed to be an extension of the nightmare that surrounded us. Everything was so dark, so dull. One of the men came to my window and, with a sharp movement, waved his hand. There was no need for words. The mere fact that he had approached me with such dangerous calm said all I needed to know. The threat was clear. If we did not deliver what they had in mind, we would not live to tell the tale. My body was paralyzed. I was completely aware of what was happening, but my mind was not reacting. Why? Why couldn't I do anything? My hands, which had always been steady, now felt empty, unable to defend my family. Fear had gripped me with such intensity that I could think of nothing else but the image of my wife and children under threat from these men. The seconds seemed to stretch on, but there was nothing I could do. I looked at my wife. She was looking at me. Her expression was full of fear, but also of quiet determination, as if she was trying to protect us all with her gaze. The rain was falling steadily on the car, as if the sky had aligned itself with the internal storm that was going on in my chest. I could hear the sound of the rain hitting the roof of the vehicle, the rumble of distant thunder, but the only thing that mattered to me at that moment was the threat that loomed over us. The man at my window motioned for me to lower the glass. I did. There was no other choice. The man's hand slid in quickly and began emptying the console compartments. He grabbed the car keys, the wallet, the cell phone he had left on the seat. I was completely immobilized. There was nothing I could do to stop him. I knew that if I tried to resist, the consequences would be much worse. The tension was unbearable. In the back, the other man had begun to search the car, looking for something I couldn't identify. I could hear his footsteps moving away toward the children. For a moment I feared they would wake them up, but they didn't. The storm seemed to have swallowed any sound, and for some reason, the fact that the children were still asleep was the only thing that allowed me to maintain some control over my emotions. When it was all over, when the men drove away and returned to their van, an eerie silence fell over the place. The rain was still falling, but it no longer felt so deafening. The air was heavy, filled with a dense fog that enveloped everything. The storm continued its course, but nothing seemed to matter anymore. Everything was empty. The calm that followed the chaos was a terrifying calm. We stood there, staring at the view, speechless. I couldn't look into my wife's eyes. I couldn't look at my children. I was completely broken inside, but I couldn't let anyone see it. I couldn't let them realize what had just happened. The shame was eating me up. When we finally put the car in gear and continued on our way, the landscape was no longer the same. The lights on the road looked far away, as if we were walking in a dream from which we could not wake up. Nobody said a word. No one asked questions. No one tried to explain what had just happened. Days passed, but the silence after the encounter with those men did not dissipate. There were no words between us, no explanations, no accusations. Fear had settled so deeply in our lives that we did not even dare to discuss what had happened. Silence covered everything, like an invisible cloak that isolated us from each other. The trip that was originally meant to be an opportunity to relax turned into a somber reminder of how fragile life is, how vulnerable we are in a world full of shadows lurking around every corner. As the days turned into weeks, the feeling of having been scarred by something far greater than we could have imagined took hold. Sometimes, when the storm came down hard, I could hear the pattering of drops on the roof of the car, and for an instant, the image of those two men would return to my mind. I was overcome with a sense of helplessness so deep that it was hard to breathe. I felt that the threat had not gone away. It had only become a silent nightmare that would haunt me until the end of my days. We never went back to the beach. Not even once. The place that once evoked memories of happy days with my family, of laughter and relaxation under the sun, became a forbidden space. As if the sand and sea were now symbols of a darkness we could not avoid. Family vacations, once synonymous with freedom, enjoying company and fresh air, no longer made sense. We had become prisoners of a fear we did not know how to approach. During those 7 years, my life was never the same. Every time I got in the car, looking in the rearview mirror, I wondered if they were around. Paranoia began to take hold of me. I began to avoid certain roads, especially those that took me on more lonely or desolate routes. I felt uneasy whenever I saw a car parked suspiciously, or when some stranger approached me. My mind couldn't help but anticipate the worst, even in the most trivial moments. The rain, the constant storm, had become my new enemy. It wasn't just the sound of the water hitting the glass that haunted me, but the way each storm brought back echoes of that afternoon. Sometimes, when the storm was particularly strong, I would find myself sitting alone in the car, looking out the window, sensing something lurking in the shadows. I had lost the sense of security I once had. Everything seemed fragile and ephemeral. The storm was no longer just a natural phenomenon. It was a reminder of the constant danger lurking in the unknown. And yet, we never talked about what happened. My wife, my children, everyone seemed to understand that it was too scary to mention. We knew what had happened, but on some level, each of us decided not to talk about it, as if talking about it would make it more real, as if mentioning the details would make the threat even more palpable. My thoughts always went back to that decision we made, not to resist, not to fight for our lives. Would it have made a difference if we had? If I had thrown myself into defending my family, even if only with my fists, would I have had a chance? Those questions were never answered. And over time I realized that maybe it didn't even matter. The fear was not just in what the men might have done. The real fear was in what the encounter had revealed. How our life, our perception of security, depended on a fragile thread, on a chain of circumstances we did not control. Worst of all, that vulnerability had not dissipated, even after so long. The fact that I didn't know if those men would ever cross my path again tore me up inside. But even more, it terrified me to think about the fact that if they came back, we would no longer be able to face them. We would no longer be the same. As the years went by, fear became a kind of perpetual shadow hanging over our heads. Perhaps with time, the scars became less visible, but they were still there, marking our lives, our family, our ability to live without fear. We all changed in some way. My wife became more reserved. My children grew up with a slightly more somber view of the world. I, for my part, became a man who could no longer rely on the tranquility of a normal day. Something snapped inside me, and I could never be the same. The lesson I learned in those years of storms, of fears and silences, is that the true fragility of human beings does not lie in what can happen to them in an obvious way, or in what can be seen with the naked eye. Vulnerability is not a fate we can foresee, but an insidious process. Fear is not something that stalks us only when we see it. It creeps into us like an invisible disease, and by the time we become aware of its presence, it has already taken control of our lives. The faces of those men, their cold and calculating gazes, remained engraved in my mind. They were not monsters. They were not beings of another nature. They were like us. Human beings like any other, capable of inflicting harm, capable of tearing away with a single blow the peace we believe to be unshakable. And that is how I discovered that the real terror is not in what stalks us from the shadows, nor in the ghosts that haunt us in the dark. The real terror is in the men who, like us, have the capacity to destroy what we love the most. And worst of all, sometimes we don't even need to know their names to be marked forever. Today, as I watch the rain fall and listen to the familiar sound of the drops hitting the glass, I can't help but feel that, although everything seems to be calm, something is hiding in the storm. Something, or someone, is waiting, unseen, somewhere. And though I try to convince myself that life has moved on, a small part of me knows that I will never feel safe again, not in the same way. Because somewhere, the shadow of those men still lurks, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows again. This is a reminder of human frailty and how often the greatest threats come from those who seem harmless. We live with a false sense of security, believing that everything is under control, until something out of our reach proves us otherwise. In a world where monsters are human, learning to trust our intuition, our ability to protect ourselves, and above all, our resilience, is more important than anything else. The real lesson is that we cannot always foresee what is to come, but we must always be prepared to face the unexpected, no matter how frightening it may be. I don't remember the exact day, but I do remember the moment. The afternoon had fallen as usual, at the same time, with the same monotony of every working day. My wife Marta was waiting for me at home, as she did every evening, with that smile that used to be warm and welcoming, but that I no longer felt in my chest. Somehow, the hours I spent at home with her had become a burden. What had been the love of my life, a story that once seemed like a dream, had become an unbearable routine. Marta and I no longer spoke to each other as we used to. There was no more laughter, no more passionate discussions, not even deep conversations. Only the sound of clocks, walls, furniture, the echoes of a life that was silently falling apart. At the end of the day, I didn't feel like going home. I felt empty, as if a part of me was broken. But even so, my body was still going through the routine. I decided to make a stop before I got home, something I never used to do. In a small restaurant that I used to pass by, I found a momentary refuge. The rain was falling as it always does on autumn afternoons, sticky, relentless, and enveloped me in its density. The restaurant was quiet, just a few tables occupied. I sat at the bar, at the back, ordering something quick, not really wanting to eat, just looking to escape the monotony. It was there that I saw her for the first time. She was sitting at the bar, almost as if she didn't exist, as if she vanished in the cigar smoke and the mist of the rain. An attractive woman, with long dark hair, dressed in a simple but elegant outfit. She didn't look at me right away, nor did she seem particularly interested in my presence. But something in her attitude, in how she kept her distance from everything, attracted me. Perhaps it was the confidence she projected, or maybe it was the sadness that seemed to cloud her eyes, something that connected me to my own emptiness. I decided to break the silence and greet her, expecting nothing more than an uncompromising conversation. The talk began in a trivial way, but before long it became something much deeper. Her name was Daniela, and although I didn't know it at the time, her presence would change everything that remained of my life. For hours we talked about everything and nothing, about our lives, about what we were looking for, about the mistakes we had made. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a deep understanding that I hadn't found in Marta in a long time. We talked until the clock struck midnight, and for the first time in months, I felt that someone understood me. I felt like I was alive. Time passed quickly, as it always does when you're caught up in something that makes you feel real again. For weeks, I kept seeing her, almost without realizing it. Every time I ran into her, I felt more attracted, more in need of her company. She didn't care that I was married, or that my life was full of broken commitments. She accepted my relationship with Marta without question. I had made it clear to her, without saying it explicitly, that she was just a fling. But Daniela didn't ask questions, didn't pressure me. Somehow that made her more attractive. She was the perfect escape, the safety valve my life needed. As time went by, the bond with Marta became weaker and weaker. The routine of the days, the daily chores, the same empty conversations, all that pushed me more towards Daniela. And she, calmly, no matter what, accepted everything. I got to know her completely, her personality, her history, her dreams, but also her insecurities. Yet, for some reason, she was never really jealous. I was her lover, yes, but I also offered her something that Marta could no longer give me: excitement, mystery, the danger of the forbidden. Little by little, I began to distance myself from Marta. I no longer felt the same passion as before, and when I got home, I found it hard to face her. The relationship, once our strength, had become a silent battlefield, but not enough for either of us to express it. We were simply living on the sidelines of each other, unwilling to look at what was really going on. 2 years passed. 2 years of a double life. And in those 2 years, things started to go awry. Daniela, who until that moment had been so understanding, began to show signs of jealousy. Marta, for some reason, had begun to win me back. It seemed that, like me, she had begun to see our lives with new eyes, and was searching for me with an intensity that I could not ignore. It was not immediate, but gradual, but enough to make me reconsider many things. For the first time in a long time, I saw Marta again as an attractive woman, as the wife she once was. But that unleashed Daniela's fury. What started as a small crack in our relationship quickly turned into a storm. She started asking me questions, uncomfortable questions. She would send me messages full of frustration and jealousy. My life was no longer as simple as it used to be. The woman who had accepted my uncomplicated infidelity began to demand answers. The threats began to come. It wasn't just a matter of passive jealousy. Now, Daniela felt she had lost something that had belonged to her, and it was not something she was prepared to accept. Worst of all, in the midst of this silent war, I was trapped. I didn't know how to handle the situation. Marta already knew about Daniela, and although she didn't say it directly, the tensions were evident. The war between them had begun, and I was the only one in the middle, not knowing who to defend, who to protect. I couldn't choose between one and the other. I did not know what to do. The threat looming over my life and my relationship was palpable, but at the same time I avoided it, as if by ignoring it I could move on. But that night, the situation came to a head. The clock was ticking, but the minutes felt like hours. The rain pounded on the windows furiously, as if the storm wanted to accompany the chaos that was crumbling inside the house. The sound of the water was deafening, but it was the softest of all noises. The creaking of the floorboards under Daniela's feet, Marta's and my gasping breaths, all of it was far more deafening. Every second seemed to be weighted with the weight of what we had done, with the weight of what we were going to lose. I was trapped. I didn't know if my heart was pounding harder from fear or from the guilt burning inside me. Daniela, her eyes wild with anger, moved around the house like a cornered animal, looking for any excuse to unleash her fury. She saw me as prey, as a lost trophy that she was trying to get back at all costs. Marta stood in the hallway, paralyzed, knowing that any wrong word could make things worse. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to calm the storm that had broken out inside Daniela. It had been a mistake, and I knew it. But I couldn't undo it. I couldn't go back to the days before Marta, before Daniela. And there he was, caught between the two women, not knowing who to protect, not knowing how to stop the disaster that was unfolding. "Get out of the house," Daniela ordered me, her voice cracking with fury. Her body trembled, but not from fear, but from restrained rage. Marta looked up at me, her eyes full of despair. She didn't need to say anything. We both knew Daniela was out of control. The tone of her voice became more aggressive, more heartbreaking. "This is my home now. You are no one anymore. You are nothing to her anymore." The words hit me with the force of a hammer. I knew it. I knew it deep inside me. I was losing everything. The house, which had been my refuge, my home, had become a death trap. The rain pounded mercilessly on the roof, as if it were giving its own judgment. Deep down, I felt that the decisions I had made had led me to this very moment. The idea of escaping this storm, of resolving it, seemed as far away as sunlight through the clouds. The tension was mounting. Daniela started walking towards the kitchen, and I followed her, instinctively, not knowing what I was going to do. I looked toward Marta, who was standing in the doorway of the living room, waiting for some sign, some indication that this could end without further damage. But there wasn't. I couldn't escape. I couldn't even get Daniela to look at me like before, when everything seemed simple. Suddenly, the sound of a thump broke the stillness of the air. Daniela had grabbed a knife from the kitchen. She held it in both hands, her face contorted with fury and pain. I didn't know if she was capable of using it, but in that instant, I felt she could. I knew it too. At that moment, all of us were on the verge of a line, of an irrevocable break. "Don't go near her," I said, more out of fear than any real threat. I knew my words carried no weight in that situation. I had crossed so many lines already that all that was left was chaos. Marta's life, which had always been on the back burner for me, was now all that mattered. The knife gleamed in the dim light of the kitchen, like a reflection of what had broken inside me. I gritted my teeth and took a step toward Daniela. I had to do something, anything. I couldn't let what I had built fall apart like this. But Daniela's gaze stopped me in my tracks. It was an empty, cold stare. She was no longer fighting for me, for our relationship. She was fighting for something much deeper, much darker. She wanted revenge. She wanted to destroy everything we had created, everything that had meant so much to me. And then, at that moment, the situation became even more unreal. Daniela raised the knife, not in a gesture of direct attack, but as if she were playing with it, letting me see the intent, the desire for control. I was in the middle, caught between the two women who, in that instant, could no longer be a separate part of my life. They were intertwined, irreversible. A fatal bond had been born between them, with my decisions as the thread that tied them together. And that night, there was no turning back. Martha screamed, a piercing scream that mingled with the roar of the storm outside. She was terrified, her voice laden with despair. I turned, but what I saw in her eyes was the last thing I would have expected to see at that moment. It wasn't fear, it wasn't horror. It was understanding, acceptance. Martha knew that somehow this had been inevitable. We had drifted too far apart, and this was the price. The air was saturated. It seemed as if time had stopped. Daniela, who had been looking for any excuse to vent her anger, calmed down for an instant. Her eyes, once wild, now seemed empty. The fury dissipated, and in its place appeared despair. But there were no tears. None of that. Just a tense calm, as if everything that had happened up to that moment had dissolved into an absolute void. I sat up slowly, my legs shaking, unable to support my own weight. I didn't understand what was happening. I had lost control. I had failed in every decision. The pieces of my life, of my world, were falling at my feet, and I could do nothing. The storm outside, the storm inside, everything seemed to be an echo of the disaster we had created. But then, in that strange silence, I understood. I had gone too far. My actions, my lies, everything had led to this moment, this confrontation, this chaos. Deep down, I knew that, even if everything seemed to calm down, nothing would ever be the same again. Somehow, after hours that felt like days, Daniela dropped the knife. It was not a surrender, not a victory. It was just the end of a story that had been written with wrong decisions. All that remained was the storm, the echo of the rain, and the feeling that she had lost everything. When everything seems to be lost, when decisions lead us to dark places, we realize that true strength lies not in running away from problems, but in facing them honestly. Relationships, like life itself, are fragile and easily destroyed by the lies we tell ourselves. Monsters are not always those that lurk in the dark, but those that we build within our own minds, fueled by ego and fear. The lesson is clear. Never underestimate the power of a decision, nor the ability of a life to crumble when there is no control left. The real terror is not in what you stand to lose, but in what you have already lost without realizing it. The wind was pounding hard on the windows of my apartment, a sound that mingled with the incessant pounding of the rain against the glass. The storm was brutal that night, as if the sky decided to unload its full weight on the city. I was sitting in front of my desk, my mind caught up in a dilemma that had been forming over the past few weeks. It had all started with my brother Mauricio's phone calls. Always solemn, always calm. But lately his voice was charged with tension, with fear. Something was going on with his company, something I couldn't understand until I decided to investigate on my own. Mauricio had created a small mobile services company that had grown rapidly in recent years. His ability to connect people, to offer them a faster and more accessible service, allowed him to win customers in a market that was becoming increasingly competitive. And of course, not everyone liked that. The owner of a competing company, Daniel Fernando, seemed to be the most affected by Mauricio's rise. Fernando, a calculating and ruthless man, had witnessed the rapid growth of my brother's company, and his envy had turned him into an enemy. What started out as healthy business competition soon morphed into something much darker. Fernando could not accept that a newcomer was gaining ground on his company with a quality of service that he could never achieve. The first threat came by phone. Mauricio called me one night, with fear evident in his voice. He said his company was being sabotaged. At first, he thought it was a coincidence, perhaps internal mismanagement, but they soon realized that the problems were systematic. Their network cables were being cut with surgical precision, and technical problems were increasing without explanation. Customers began to complain, and some migrated to competitors. It was then that the threats came in full force. If you don't stop your growth, if you don't close your company, this is all going to get a lot worse, he was told in one of the calls. I knew my brother better than anyone. I knew he wouldn't give up, but I also knew he couldn't face something so sinister alone. No one could. And that's when I decided I had to step in. That same night, without thinking too much about it, I headed for Mauricio's company building. The pouring rain made visibility difficult, but the storm didn't stop me. There was something in the air that night, something that made me feel that the situation was about to escalate into something much more dangerous. When I arrived at my brother's office, the place was empty except for a couple of lights on in the desks. The air smelled musty and of burnt wires. On one of the desks, Mauricio had left some of the evidence of the sabotage. The technical reports detailed systematic cuts in the network, both in the main cables and in the secondary cables connecting the customers. The extent of the damage was alarming, but what really chilled my blood was a small note on his office desk, signed in messy handwriting. This is just the beginning. What is to come will be worse. I decided to investigate further. The security cameras showed nothing out of the ordinary, but something told me that Fernando was not the only one behind this. The violence and sabotage could not be coincidental. Someone was paying someone to do this, and I needed to know who. The idea that my brother was being targeted by a dirty corporate war was unbearable. I left the office and headed for one of the off-site facilities my brother had on the outskirts of the city, where the servers that managed the network were located. I was determined to find some clue that would lead me directly to those responsible. The road there was long, and the rain was relentless. The country roads were deserted, and the darkness of the night made them even more intimidating. Every time lightning lit up the sky, I felt as if I were moving toward an uncertain destination, toward something I did not yet fully understand. When I arrived at the facility, something didn't seem right. The front door was open, which was odd, as everything should have been locked for security. I entered the building cautiously, with the feeling that something or someone was waiting for me. Wires were hanging from the walls, the network was in disarray, and the computers had been tampered with. There was no doubt that someone had been there, and not in a friendly way. Suddenly, a sound of footsteps on the upper floor made me stop. My breathing quickened. I was not alone. I approached the staircase and climbed carefully. Each step creaked under my weight, as if the building itself was about to collapse. As I reached the second floor, I saw a figure gliding down a dark hallway. I couldn't see his face, but his presence was unmistakable. The man stopped in front of one of the computers, typing rapidly. It was obvious that someone was trying to manipulate the data or erase evidence. Without thinking, I lunged toward him, but before I could do anything, a cold, firm hand grabbed me by the throat and pushed me against the wall. I stood there, stunned, unable to move. I felt the air rush out of me. The figure stared at me with a cold, calculating look. It was Fernando, the owner of my brother's rival company. I knew that somehow everything that had happened would lead me to him. He didn't say a word. He just let go of me, and before he left one last warning. This has only just begun. You can't beat someone like me. With my heart pounding in my chest, I knew that the war was at its peak, and now I was part of it too. Time began to dissolve into a spiral of distrust and paranoia. As the days progressed, Fernando's threats became more direct and frightening. The rain was relentless, and at some point, the constant sound of the storm mingled with my growing anxiety. I couldn't stop thinking about my brother's safety, but I couldn't stop thinking about Fernando's threat either. Something told me that if I didn't act fast, something much worse could happen. I had decided not to involve the police. I knew Fernando had enough resources to twist any investigation in his favor, and although the threat to my brother was imminent, so was the pressure I felt on my shoulders. My family didn't know it, but I was making life and death decisions every time I investigated further. Fernando's infiltration inside my brother's company had become evident. He had managed to find a crack through which to slip in, a mole inside the company that provided him with all the crucial information about our movements. But the details didn't add up. How could Fernando know so much? Why did the threats come just as my brother was starting to gain more clients? It all seemed like a meticulously orchestrated move. At that moment, I realized that I was not alone in this dirty game. One afternoon, while reviewing security footage, something caught my attention. A man dressed in work clothes, but wearing a visitor's badge, appeared in several shots, always at the exact moments when my brother's network systems failed. He was no ordinary worker. He had come in several times at unusual times and had stopped at strategic points in the office, just before the cables were disconnected or the servers shut down. With each new look at the recordings, I confirmed what I feared. My brother was not only being attacked from the outside, but also from the inside. That man was no stranger. After reviewing the employee records, I discovered that he was a former employee of Mauricio's company, someone who had been fired months earlier for low productivity. This man's name was Alex Montoya, and apparently he had decided to do Fernando a favor in exchange for money. A deadly favor, of course. The revelation shook me. Not only was Fernando using dirty tactics, but he was also counting on someone close to my brother to sabotage him from the inside. Alex had been fired for his incompetence, and now he seemed to be taking revenge, with Fernando promising to make him rich at the cost of destroying everything my brother had accomplished. It was clear that I had to act. I could not allow this man to remain a shadow in my brother's company. If Alex was willing to betray his own employer for money, I didn't know how far he would go to destroy what was left of my family. This was no longer about simple sabotage or anonymous phone calls. There was something more sinister afoot, something that could end it all at any moment. I decided to confront Fernando. I knew that in doing so, I was entering dangerous territory, but I had no choice. The threat of losing everything, of seeing my brother fall into a hole from which he could not climb out, was more terrifying than anything else. There was no turning back. The future of my family, my brother, and his company was at stake, and I could not stand idly by. At that point, my life no longer resembled what it had been before. Every time I went out on the street, I felt like I was walking in a minefield, waiting for the moment when everything would explode. I knew Fernando wouldn't stop until he destroyed my brother, and if I didn't do something, I would probably be the one to suffer the consequences. I plucked up my courage and headed for Fernando's offices. I knew he was a calculating man, and that if I met him without warning, he could be more dangerous than ever. I drove through the rain, which fell relentlessly on the windshield of the car, while the sound of the water mixed with the beating of my heart. Each passing second was heavier, as if the storm around me was not only external, but also internal. Upon arrival, Fernando's building was completely silent. No movement, no sign of life, except for a couple of lights flickering inside. It was no ordinary office. Everything was carefully designed to intimidate anyone who entered. The building had a structure that seemed unyielding, both inside and out. The facade was imposing. Everything was steel and glass, and the metal doors closed with a deep clang, as if to seal off any hope of escape. Cautiously, I entered. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as I advanced towards Fernando's office. Everything seemed to be in order, almost too perfect. But something told me that this man was not so predictable. I couldn't help but feel that he was watching me. The air was charged with tension, as if the place was waiting for me to make a decision that would change everything. When I arrived in front of his office door, I saw that it was ajar. I wasn't sure what to expect, but what I saw left me cold. Fernando was sitting behind his desk, a glass of wine in his hand, looking over my brother's company reports. I knew he had been waiting for me. It was as obvious as it was unexpected. He didn't need to ask how I had found him, because he already knew. In this game, stealth and surprise didn't matter. There was only one confrontation left. However, the most surprising thing was not finding him there, in his office, but what he did next. Fernando put the cup down on the desk and slowly stood up. His gaze was fixed, almost arrogant. There was no trace of regret or fear in him, as if everything was under his control. "I told you this had only just begun," he said, without moving. For a moment, I felt a strange sensation. It wasn't just fear. It was a mixture of fury and despair, a feeling that had not accompanied me before. Everything I had built, everything my brother had accomplished, was on the verge of collapse, and the figure in front of me was the piece that was destroying it. "How far will you go?" I thought. I had no answers. I just knew that if I didn't do something soon, we would lose everything. Fernando waved his hand, and one of his employees appeared from the shadows. It was Alex Montoya, the former employee of my brother's company, the traitor who had been sabotaging from the inside. My eyes met his, but I couldn't read anything in his expression. It was as if it no longer mattered. He had made his choice. I realized that I was no longer fighting to save a company or even my brother. I was fighting for something much more important: integrity, honor, loyalty that had been shattered by wrong decisions. That encounter was not a victory, neither for me nor for my brother. It was the moment I understood that battles are not always won. Sometimes, all you can do is survive the consequences of your decisions. In life, we often face dilemmas that force us to choose between loyalty, morality, and survival. The decisions we make today are the ones that will define us tomorrow, but we can rarely predict all the consequences. Ambition and revenge blind us and drag us into a game that is not always played with clear rules. Sometimes winning means losing everything. And the worst thing is that we do not always know what we have lost until it is too late. In this world, not all enemies are visible to the naked eye. Some hide in the shadows, disguised as allies. And in the end, we realize that the most difficult battle is the one we fight with ourselves. It was an ordinary night, at least that's what I thought when I decided to stay home. The calmness that the city breathed from my window was deceptive, but I knew that much later. My family, like almost every night, was at a party, and I, tired of the routine, preferred to stay home. I didn't feel like socializing or being among people. Sometimes, the simple fact of being alone, in the quiet of your own home, was enough to find peace. But that night, peace would be a fleeting illusion. I closed the curtains, settled on the sofa, and immersed myself in the monotony of the television. The rain, soft at first, began to fall harder. The sound of the drops hitting the window glass accompanied me like a distant, almost comforting melody. I remained silent, watching the images on the screen, but not really seeing them. My mind was elsewhere, wandering, thinking about unimportant things. Suddenly, a noise broke the calm. A sharp, loud thud, a sound that I couldn't identify at first, but that my instinct told me was not normal. It was the kind of sound made when something hits metal or something heavy falls to the ground. It wasn't the sound of rain or the wind starting to whip the streets harder. No, this one was different. A thump that echoed off the walls of the house, as if coming from outside. I got up from the couch with a strange feeling, as if something in the air had changed, something that was not visible, but could be felt. I looked out the window, but saw nothing. The darkness was swallowing the garden, and the rain did not allow to see beyond a few meters. I thought maybe it was some animal or a neighbor making noise unintentionally. Nothing important, I thought. I returned to the couch, feeling that it had been a false alarm. But it wasn't long before I heard it again. Another knock. This time, louder. Something was trying to get into my house. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't the wind. Someone was there, and clearly not welcome. At that moment, something changed inside me. The calm that I had felt moments before disappeared completely. Adrenaline began to rush through my body, and my mind began to work at full speed. Who could it be? What did he want? Without thinking too much, I got up again and headed for the back door, where the sound seemed to come more clearly. My heart was pounding, and although my body was tense, my steps were cautious. I looked out the dining room window, searching for any sign. I saw nothing, but the feeling that someone was lurking grew. Suddenly, I heard something that chilled my blood. A creaking sound, followed by a sharp knock on the front door. This was no longer a fluke sound. This was the sound of an attempt to break in. My mind started racing, evaluating all the options. I had a security camera covering the entrance, and although I didn't feel prepared to confront anyone, the first thing I did was check the monitor. What I saw on the screen took my breath away. A man, dressed in dark clothes, stood in front of my door. He was not a simple thief. He was someone who knew what he was doing. His face was not visible, but his movements were precise, calculated. There was something about the way he was acting that didn't fit with a simple robbery. The man did not appear to be looking for money or material goods. Something else was at stake, but he didn't know what. The security camera captured his every move. I saw how he picked the lock, how his hands moved with terrifying dexterity. He was trying to get in. He was there, outside my house, ready to cross that invisible line that separates invasion from tranquility, the violation of personal space. For a moment, I felt a deep chill run through me. The decision to do something or stand still hit me like a bullet in the chest. If I called the police, they would not arrive in time. If I made noise, I would alert the intruder. What I wanted most of all was to disappear, but the only logical choice was to act. Suddenly, the man stopped knocking on the door. For a few seconds, everything fell into a tense silence. What was he doing? My breathing became heavier. The sound of the rain outside seemed to deafen everything, covering any other noise the intruder might have made. What happened next was not a simple scare, it was a real nightmare. The man, with surprising agility, began to bang harder, and this time, the door gave way. The latch broke easily. My heart stopped for a second as I watched helplessly as the entrance to my home was violated. I didn't know what to do. My body was paralyzed, and my thoughts could not process what I saw. A man was inside my house. A stranger had crossed the line. My home, my refuge, was no longer safe. My hands were shaking, and sweat was running down my forehead as I fought the panic that gripped me. The man did not say a word. He didn't need to. He knew what he was doing. At that moment, I realized that this was no ordinary thief. This man had planned this. His every move was designed to scare me, to make me feel vulnerable. And at that very moment, he had succeeded. I felt like I was drowning, trapped in a room that was once my refuge. I lay down on the ground, trying to make myself as small as possible, hoping the man hadn't heard me. The camera was still recording, but I no longer knew if the risk of confronting him was greater than the risk of staying hidden. Every time the man got closer, the tension increased. I couldn't get out. I couldn't run away. I had to stay still, even though fear was pushing me to do the opposite. At some point, the man stopped. I didn't understand. Something made him change direction. He moved away from the door, walking silently through the house, making no noise, like an animal stalking its prey. It was only when I heard his footsteps moving away that I could breathe a momentary sigh of relief. Was he gone? Had he left me alone? Minutes passed, but nothing happened. The door was still broken. The house was still an invaded space, and I was still trembling, expecting the worst. But the man never came back in. He left, as he came, without a trace. The next morning, when my family returned, I found the security camera recording the night's events. The man had entered, but I never knew his intentions. All I was left with was a strange feeling, a sense that this encounter had not been casual. The fear did not go away, and paranoia began to consume my mind. Every time the rain hit the windows, I wondered, what would have happened if the man had walked through that door? What would have happened if I hadn't been able to stand still? The following days were strange, as if a veil of darkness had settled over me, covering everything. The worst thing was not the fact that the man had managed to get into my house. The worst thing was that, even though he was gone, something inside me changed. The fear didn't go with him. No matter how many times I tried to convince myself, the feeling of vulnerability was constantly with me. And the rain, that constant that had shaped the night of the attack, became a kind of grim reminder of what had happened. From that night on, nothing was the same. Before, the sound of the rain seemed welcoming, almost soothing. Now, every drop that hit the windows was a reminder of the impending risk, of how a quiet life could turn to chaos in the blink of an eye. I could no longer enjoy the sound of water falling on the roof. Every rumble that echoed from outside made me think that he had returned, that the footsteps I heard in the distance were his, stalking again. The security camera was still recording, and that was one of the few things that offered me some comfort. At least I had evidence of what had happened, although it was an empty consolation. Over the next few nights, I was forced to review the recordings over and over again, as if watching them would give me some kind of control over the situation, although deep down I knew it was an illusion. Every time I played it back, the images of that man would paralyze me all over again. He was there, at my door, and although his movements were quick, calculated, I sensed that something else was behind his behavior. It wasn't just a robbery. He was looking for something. I didn't know what, but there was something else in his eyes, something I couldn't identify, a kind of desperation. At first, it all seemed confusing, but as the days went by, something began to stick in my head, the details. I was able to observe more clearly the way he had acted. I was not alone. Just on the fringes of the camera's image, I could make out a shadow in the garden. My heart stopped as I understood what I was seeing. The man had not been alone. He was in company. It was not clearly visible, but there was another figure. It was thin, almost invisible, as if the other man had wanted to hide it on purpose. It took me several tries to realize that the figure was not a reflection, nor the movement of shadows caused by the wind. No, it was a person, a human figure that stood silently behind him, watching, waiting. From that moment on, a new layer of fear settled over me. It hadn't just been an assault, nor a simple invasion. There was more to it. Perhaps the man who had broken into my house was not the main actor in all of this. Maybe he was just a piece in a much bigger game. Something told me that my home hadn't been the only target, and that terrified me even more. Why was I targeted? Why my home? And, most importantly, who was this second person? For days, I could think of nothing else. Living my daily life became a routine parallel to the growing paranoia that dominated me. Going out to work, going to the grocery store, sleeping, everything became a mechanical act, but my mind never stopped going back to that recording. From time to time, I would check the cameras in the house, making sure there was no sign of anyone else nearby. The tension that had taken over my home was palpable. The furniture, which had once seemed comfortable to me, now seemed like fragile barriers that could easily be destroyed. The sound of the rain, which I once found soothing, was no longer so. It now mingled with the echoes of my own thoughts, creating an oppressive atmosphere. One afternoon, while reviewing the video once again, I noticed something else. In the footage, after the man forced the door open and entered, I could make out something even more frightening. Just as he began to move through the house, something in the entryway near the kitchen seemed to glow in the distance. It was a faint, almost imperceptible light. but it was there. At the time, I didn't immediately understand what it meant, but when I analyzed the recording more closely, I realized it was no ordinary light. It was a flashlight, and the figure holding it was not that of a robust man like the first one, but of a more agile, more elusive person. The same shadow he had seen in the garden. The person who had remained hidden. Who was he? Why was he there? All this was becoming more and more disturbing. It was then that paranoia completely took hold of me. During the nights, even when I took shelter under the blankets, I felt that someone was watching me from the outside. I knew I couldn't trust anyone or anything. The shadows seemed to move around the house. The walls creaked in a different way, as if they were breathing, waiting for something. He couldn't stop thinking about the idea that this second person might still be around. I was convinced that if he or she hadn't taken something that night, they would do it some other time. Why hadn't they stolen anything? Why hadn't they done anything but break down the door and snoop around my house? Worst of all, the man who had broken into my house didn't seem to be in a hurry. He didn't act like he was running away, like a common thief who takes what he can and leaves. No, he was moving calmly, almost as if he was scouting the place, looking for something specific, as if he knew every nook and cranny of my house. And that thought began to eat me up inside. Had he been watching me before? Had he made a plan for that night? The following nights were a real torment. Every noise, every creak, every movement out of place made me think he was back. The lights in the garden, the sounds coming from the alley behind my house, put me on alert. Sometimes, when I looked out the window, I could see strange reflections in the shadows. Was it him? Was it someone else? The doubts consumed me. The fear grew with each passing day, and though I tried to return to routine, something in me had changed forever. My confidence in my home, in my safety, was completely gone. The night became an enemy, the rain a warning. Each day that passed without the man's return was only an anxious wait, a breath suspended in the air. The feeling that something else was going to happen didn't go away. It only intensified. After a few days without incident, something strange happened. One afternoon, as I was returning home, I saw something that made my heart stop. The front door, which had been destroyed after the attempted break-in, was locked. At first I didn't believe it, but when I approached, I saw that there was no sign of damage. Nothing. The door was repaired, as if it had never been forced. Someone had come, fixed what was broken, and left without a trace. I was completely overcome with terror. Who had done that? Why? The only conclusion I could come to was that they knew I was watching them. The man, the shadow, the details hidden in the recordings, everything pointed to the fact that this nightmare was not over. I was just another piece in a macabre game. This experience, though seemingly over, left deep scars in my mind. What happened that night? What lies ahead for me and my family? The fears that haunt us are not always visible, nor do they always have form. Sometimes the threat comes from those around us, those we know, or even those we think we have left behind. In one quiet night, our lives can change forever. Fear is not just an emotion. It is a shadow that lingers long after the threat is gone, long after the door has been repaired. And even if we look for answers, we can never really be sure that it's all over. The danger is closer than we think, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. July 30th, several years ago now, was a seemingly ordinary day. The rain was falling like a thick curtain, obscuring the landscape, but the sound of the water hitting the roof of the car was almost comforting. I was driving on my way to work, accompanied by two friends, Fermin and Abel, as we used to do every day. We were in my old Aveo, a car that had seen better days, but that was still going strong, resisting the roads with the same tenacity with which we faced the daily routine. The weather wasn't perfect, but by that time in the morning, we had already gotten used to the idea that rain would be our company. The road, which was normally quiet, seemed deserted that day. At first we didn't notice anything strange. We talked as usual, about soccer, about work, about what we had done over the weekend. Fermin was behind the wheel, as I liked to rest while he drove. Abel, sitting in the back seat, gave his opinion on everything as usual. However, the calm of our drive was interrupted when we saw a woman in the distance walking along the side of the road. She was an elderly lady, dressed in plain clothes and wet from the rain. She seemed lost, and although she was not asking for help, there was something in her erratic walk that made us hesitate. Fermin, with his usual gesture of generosity, suggested we stop and offer her a ride. It was a natural impulse. We were not usually people who turned down the opportunity to help others, and this lady seemed to be in trouble. So we decided to give her the tail, without thinking too much about the consequences. Sometimes people in the countryside were kind, and we saw no reason to be suspicious. When he got into the car, we noticed that something was not right. His face, wrinkled by the years and furrowed with marks of suffering, was distant, as if he didn't fully understand what was happening. His gaze was empty, lost, and he remained silent as we settled in to continue our journey. Fermin, trying to make polite conversation, asked if she needed help, but the woman did not respond. Instead, she began to fidget restlessly, as if looking for something inside her purse. At that moment, that's when we saw her. With a quick movement, he pulled out a knife, one of those long, thick-bladed knives that used to cut meat or bread. It wasn't just any knife, but one that looked freshly sharpened. A shiver ran through my body. Abel, who was in the back, was silent, clearly worried, but none of the three of us knew what to do. Fermin tried to remain calm, but the atmosphere in the car immediately became tense. The lady, with her gaze fixed on us, began to mumble incoherently. She said things that made no sense, and with a crooked smile, she pointed the knife at us, as if it were some kind of silent threat. At that moment, I felt something change in the air. The atmosphere was getting heavier and heavier, as if the rain was no longer enough to lighten the situation. The sound of water hitting the windshield became a distant murmur, almost irrelevant to what was happening inside the car. Somehow, I knew we were caught up in something dangerous, though I didn't understand exactly how. The lady, who had been so quiet before, began to move restlessly, brushing her hands over the knife. It was as if she was looking for something, or someone. We tried not to look directly at her, but the terror began to sink in. Fermin tried to drive normally, without making any sudden movements that might infuriate her even more. But as the kilometers passed, I realized that the lady was not going to leave us alone. Every time Fermin went ahead or took a curve, she would tighten her grip on the knife, as if we were getting closer and closer to losing control of the situation. The lady, who at first had been almost inert, now began to mutter incoherent threats. She was not addressing anyone in particular, but seemed to be talking to herself, as if lost in her own world. However, her eyes, when we managed to make eye contact, did not show the disorientation of someone with mental problems, but a kind of cold calculation, a coldness that did not correspond to her harmless appearance. This seemingly fragile and vulnerable lady, at that very moment, became a tangible threat. Why didn't she ask for help? Why was she so desperate? My mind, full of questions, could not find answers. I only knew that the situation had taken a turn of no return. As they passed a couple of small towns, the woman began to speak more clearly, as if she was no longer so confused. "I'll take them all away. You have no idea what you are doing," she muttered. I didn't know if she was saying it to scare us, or if she really thought we were a danger to her, but I felt a cold sweat running down my back. I tried to calm down, but the atmosphere in the car was unbearable. Abel, in the back seat, was almost motionless. I just stared out the window, watching the rain falling steadily, but I felt there was no escape. The water droplets seemed to patter loudly, as if they too wanted to enter the vehicle, as if the rain had become an extension of our own despair. The journey seemed endless. Every second that passed, I felt more restless, more trapped. The landscapes outside the window passed by like blurred shadows. In the distance, a winding road faded into the darkness, while the lady, knife still in hand, constantly threatened us. In her broken mind, we were no longer helping her. We were part of a macabre game she had invented. The threat, though vague, was clear. She could attack us at any moment. It all depended on her state of mind, on her will. And that was the most terrifying thing. We were at her mercy. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the lady asked to be dropped off at a small crossroads. Without further words, without further threats, she simply got out of the car. She didn't say thank you, not even a goodbye. She just drove away, walking along the edge of the road, fading into the darkness. Fermín said nothing, and Abel, in the back seat, sighed in relief. But something had changed in me. There was something in that lady's eyes, something in her words, that had marked me. It was as if the threat had not disappeared, but had stayed with us. As I watched her lose herself in the storm, a thought crossed my mind. What if it wasn't an accident? What if it had all been planned? Who was she really? And why had she chosen us? After leaving the lady at that intersection, a strange feeling of relief and dread began to settle in my chest. The sound of my car's engine, which seemed insignificant to me before, became a kind of constant echo in my mind. As soon as Fermín started the car, and we were on our way, I felt that something had changed inside me. It was as if that encounter had marked a before and after, something we could not easily erase from our lives. And yet, the most disturbing thing was not what had happened, but what had remained unresolved. That woman, that figure so harmless but terrifying at the same time, had taken away a part of us that we didn't know if we could ever get back. That night, as the three of us ate dinner at home, we tried to bring up the subject amid forced laughter. Fermín, trying to relieve the tension, blurted out a comment. "Well, at least he didn't stab us, right?" We all laughed a little, but the laughter was not enough to dispel the feeling that weighed on us. Abel, who was the quietest, said nothing. His face was more serious than usual, and I could tell that something was bothering him more than the others. But it wasn't the time to talk about that, was it? After all, it had already happened, and nothing more could be done. Despite this apparent calm, something remained in the air, something heavy and ominous that we did not know how to handle. On the one hand, we were trying to convince ourselves that the lady had simply been a deranged person, someone who in her desperation had caused an unnecessary disturbance. But on the other hand, there was something in her attitude that we could not ignore. That feeling, that way of looking at us, as if she knew more than she was saying, haunted me. It was as if she was playing with us, waiting for something else to happen, as if our presence in her life was part of a larger plan that we didn't yet understand. The routine continued. The next few days seemed to pass normally, but somehow we couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Every time we took that same road, the memories were triggered with eerie clarity. It wasn't just the crossroads that made us uneasy. It was the fact that, for some reason, none of us could shake the feeling that something was lurking, something watching us from the shadows. As the weeks went by, paranoia took hold of us. I, in particular, became more cautious. At first, I thought it had been a simple, frightening experience that would fade with time, but I soon realized that I couldn't stop thinking about the lady. And not just her. What haunted me was the idea that somewhere in the world, there were people like her who didn't follow the same rules of reality as the rest of us. People who, for some inexplicable reason, could play with the fate of others, decide who lived and who didn't, just because. That feeling of being watched began to intensify. The rain, which at first seemed to be a mere annoyance, became a constant reminder of what had happened. Every time the sound of the drops hit the windshield of the car, I wondered if something or someone was stalking me, waiting for the right moment to act. At night, I would often wake up suddenly, with the feeling that someone was at my front door, waiting to come in. Sure, when I got up and checked, everything was in place, but the feeling never completely dissipated. I was trapped in a spiral of fear that I could not control. The worst came when Fermín started receiving strange calls on his cell phone. They were unknown numbers, and although he had never answered, The mere fact that someone was trying to contact him filled us with anxiety. On several occasions, the calls were cut off before they could answer, which only increased our paranoia. Abel, more nervous than ever, suggested that perhaps someone was watching us. "What if she's looking for us?" he said once, and those words echoed in my mind for days. The idea that that woman was waiting for the perfect moment to return, to get revenge or make us suffer, seemed more and more likely. One afternoon in mid-August, Fermin decided that we should investigate further. We could no longer live with this constant feeling that something else was about to happen. He grabbed his cell phone and began searching the internet, typing any word that came to mind. Strange woman on the road, knife in the car, dangerous people in the area. For hours he scanned the local news and social media, but found nothing to substantiate our suspicions. There were no records of a woman matching the description, nothing to indicate that what happened was part of something bigger. However, that didn't make the fear go away. On the contrary, it made us feel even more vulnerable. What if indeed there were no traces? What if our interaction with this woman had been more significant than we thought? The shadows around us grew thicker with each passing day. As we approached the date of our next trip along that same route, tensions rose. None of us wanted to admit that we were terrified, but we all were. The night before we left, I had trouble sleeping. I couldn't help but look out the windows every time I heard a strange sound, every time the rain hit hard. Part of me knew I was being irrational, but another part told me that somewhere in the darkness, that woman, that presence that had touched us so unexpectedly, was still waiting. That morning, as we left the house, Fermin and Abel seemed as nervous as I was. The rain was coming down hard, darkening the day. Somehow the weather had become a reflection of our emotional state. On the way, as we passed the intersection where we had left the lady, Fermin accelerated the car a little, as if he wanted to get away as fast as possible from that cursed place. None of the three of us wanted to talk, and the silence in the car became more and more oppressive. But what happened to us that day was even worse than we imagined. In the end, somehow, the story did not end that July 30th. What that lady did, what she provoked, was not just a passing scare. It was the beginning of something darker, something we could never explain. In the weeks that followed, our lives changed. The feeling of being watched, the idea that someone could burst into our lives out of nowhere, became our daily reality. We never went back to the road we had talked so much about. None of us would. But the fear that lady planted in us, the fear of the unexplainable, haunted us long afterward. Something as simple as a roadside encounter taught us that we don't always know who others are, or what dark secrets they may be hiding. What if, instead of simply giving us the tale, we had ignored that impulse to help? What if, in the end, she was just a reflection of what we all fear, the chaos that can arise in an instant without warning from what seems to be an ordinary situation? In the end, the lady's story never had a clear closure. Maybe it wasn't supposed to. Maybe life doesn't always conform to a tidy narrative. The lesson I learned, the lesson we all learned that rainy morning, was that danger never warns when it approaches. And what seems like a simple decision, a small gesture of kindness, can unleash a series of events that change a person's life forever. We cannot always foresee the impact of our actions, nor the consequences of the people we cross paths with. Perhaps all we can do is be prepared, even if we are never really ready for the unexpected. I never imagined that a simple neighbor could change my life completely. It all started out as something trivial, a little noise, some strange disappearances, little things that at first didn't seem relevant. However, in essence, I understood that something was not right. There was something disturbing in his behavior, something that slowly grew in the darkness, until I could no longer ignore it. My name is Ricardo, and this is my story. It all started when I decided to make some modifications to my house. They weren't big changes, just some remodeling that would turn the place into something more modern, a place I could call home once and for all. I had bought the house with the dream of seeing it grow, But it wasn't until I started working on the project that I noticed something odd in the neighborhood. The house next door was almost uninhabited, which wasn't very common, as the owner, a man named Martin, would come and go without notice, but with enough regularity that his presence was uncomfortable. At first, the remodeling work was exciting. Walls were knocked down, the structure of the house began to take shape, and the noises of the tools were a constant. My wife, Laura, was happy with the progress, although she noticed something curious. Sometimes she felt that someone was watching us, something that did not worry me at the time. I didn't think anything of it, assuming it was the tension of the moment, the excitement of seeing our house take shape. It was a rainy night in August when I noticed the first real sign that something was wrong. The storm was lashing hard, and the raindrops were hitting the window glass with such intensity that the sound was deafening. I was home alone, working late, when I heard a noise coming from the backyard. At first I thought it was the wind, or maybe some animal, but something inside me told me I shouldn't ignore it. I got up from my chair and went to the window, cautiously slipping between the curtains. There, in the darkness, I could see a shadow moving among the bushes. I couldn't make out anything clearly, but the reflection of the rain on the glass allowed me to see the silhouette of a person. My heart skipped a beat. Was it Martin? I couldn't be sure, but something told me it was. I decided to wait and watch. The figure moved away from the window and I could see no more. At first I tried to play it down. After all, maybe someone had passed by on the road, or a curious neighbor was looking at my work. But something didn't fit. Something about the way the figure moved made me feel it was no accident. The next few days were a mixture of tension and suspicion. Suddenly, I began to notice small things disappearing from my house. A tool, an old clock I had left on the table, a lamp in the living room. At first I thought it might have been an oversight, but each time something was missing, the feeling of discomfort intensified. That's when, on a rainy afternoon, Laura showed me something strange. She found a pair of muddy footprints on the back porch of the house, footprints that clearly didn't belong to anyone in the family. They were fresh, and that sent a shiver through my body. My mind began to associate the footprints with the shadow I had seen days before. Was it possible that someone was breaking into the house without me knowing it? That night, I decided to install security cameras in the most vulnerable areas, at the back door, near the windows, and in the garden. I didn't want to worry Laura, but I felt something was wrong, and worst of all, I didn't know if I was dealing with a common burglar or something much more sinister. The next day, the cameras were in place, and life at home seemed normal. But in the evening, as I reviewed the recordings, my pulse raced as I saw something I could never have anticipated. A figure, clearly that of Martin, appeared in the recordings. He was loitering in the garden, holding something in his hands. At first, I couldn't identify what he was carrying, but I soon understood. A pair of gloves and what looked like a screwdriver. He approached one of the windows, checked the surroundings, and without thinking, started trying to force it open. I couldn't resist the feeling of a knot in my stomach. Martin was breaking into my house. My neighbor was stealing from me. I didn't understand why he was doing it, nor how he dared to violate my space in that way. But what was worse was that I felt that the threats from that figure in the shadows went far beyond simple robberies. Martin's face in the recordings was unmistakable, and the worst thing was that the man was not afraid. It was as if he was doing it with total impunity, as if he was claiming something he felt he deserved. That same day, I made the decision. I could no longer ignore what was happening. That's when I called the authorities and reported Martin for breaking and entering. What worried me was that in doing so, I could be facing something much more dangerous than I had imagined. I didn't know how far the situation had escalated, but I felt it was no longer safe to stay there without doing something about it. The police arrived the next day and searched the property, but did not find sufficient evidence to arrest Martin. However, their actions were clear, and they undertook to monitor the situation. The next few days were a mixture of constant vigilance and fear. Martin no longer seemed to have the same calm demeanor as before. Now, every time I saw him in the neighborhood, I could feel his gaze fixed on me. There was something in his attitude, something of restrained hostility that told me this was not over. And indeed, it was not over. The rain continued to fall with the same intensity. The sound of the water hitting the roof and the windows became a sort of metronome that set the rhythm of my anguish. At that moment, the feeling of being trapped in my own house, with no way out, took hold of me. Every time the wind would rush against the walls, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. Or maybe I wanted to. I felt a presence, a tangible threat that I had never imagined in my home, a place I had always considered a refuge. The days leading up to the confrontation with Martin had been strangely quiet, or so it seemed. The thefts, though small, like tools disappearing from the shed, did not seem alarming at first. I thought perhaps someone was taking advantage of the darkness of the street, or that they were simple carelessness. But that quiet was deceptive, like a calm before the storm. The first indication that something wasn't right came when I started noticing muddy footprints near the windows of my house, even though it hadn't rained the day before. I thought it might be some animal, but the pattern of the footprints did not match that of any known animal in the area. They were human footsteps, large, as if someone had been watching from the dark, waiting for the right moment to enter. I decided to ignore it, but uneasiness began to grow inside me. I couldn't help thinking that something else was going on, that maybe I was being watched without even knowing it. It wasn't until that night, when I heard a thud at the back of the house, that I understood what was happening. At first, I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe it was the wind moving something in the yard, or some object that had been misplaced. But the knock was repeated, and this time it was louder. My steps became more cautious as I approached the back door. The dim light from the hallway illuminated the outline of the door, and something told me that I should not open it, that I should not look. But curiosity, that little spark we all carry inside us, pushed me forward. As I approached the living room window, I saw the figure of someone, a diffuse shadow in the gloom. I couldn't see him clearly, but I knew it wasn't someone passing by chance. I stood still, breathing slowly, watching the figure approach the back door. My mind tried to rationalize, to find an excuse, something to justify what I was seeing, but the truth was clear. There was someone on my property, and that person was not there by accident. I felt like a cornered animal. I knew I could not just stand there waiting for the inevitable to happen. Fear was mixed with pent-up rage, a sense of helplessness in the face of a situation I did not fully understand. I glanced quickly at my cell phone, and for an instant I hesitated whether to call the police or try to confront him myself. Every second seemed to drag on interminably. I was overwhelmed with uncertainty, and before I could decide what to do, the figure disappeared. Silence fell again like a thick layer. For a few moments, I froze, not knowing if the figure was still there, or if it had disappeared completely. Was it gone? Was it watching me? I didn't know what to think. But something told me that the threat wasn't over, that it was just a pause, a respite before the storm really began. Cautiously, I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the back door. As I opened it, I felt a shiver run through my body, as if the air had become thicker, heavier. But there was nothing. There were no footprints, no sign of a person's presence. Everything seemed normal, except for the feeling that someone, somewhere nearby, was watching me. In the days that followed, paranoia took hold of me. Every noise, every shadow in the corners of my field of vision made me jump. My home no longer felt like a haven, but like a trap. The feeling of being watched intensified. I started checking the security cameras more frequently, looking for clues, trying to find something that might confirm my fears. But the cameras showed nothing out of the ordinary, and that puzzled me even more. Was my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there something else, something I couldn't see? One day, on my way home from work, I came across something that made my heart race immediately. The back door was slightly ajar. There were no footprints, but the fact that the door was open when I always left it closed made me feel as if everything that had been happening was not a figment of my imagination. I entered cautiously, expecting the worst, but the house was empty. However, things began to take a more sinister turn when I noticed that certain objects, the ones I always left in their place, had been moved. The lamp in the dining room, the picture frame on the table, the wall clock. Everything looked slightly out of order, as if someone had been snooping around, looking for something. That same day, I decided to make a decision. I could no longer wait for the situation to resolve itself. Fear wouldn't let me sleep, and stress was building up in every corner of my mind. I had to act, but I didn't know how. I decided to install new security measures. I hired an expert to check the locks and reinforce the doors and windows. I also decided to put additional cameras in areas I hadn't considered before, such as the garden and the garage. I did all this for a very simple reason. I felt vulnerable, as if I was unknowingly playing with fire. What I could not foresee, however, was what happened that night. Despite all the measures I had taken, something told me that the threat would never go away, that Martin would never stop. It was clear that revenge, the need for control, had consumed him completely. And the worst part was that I was trapped, not knowing what to expect, not knowing if this nightmare would ever end. The next few days were a mixture of constant terror and a sense of helplessness. Although I took every precaution possible, I knew that if someone really wanted to hurt me, none of this would be enough to stop them. I was living in a perpetual state of alertness, not knowing what would come next. The knocking on the door, the shadows through the windows, the unexplained noises in the night. All of it continued to haunt me. In the end, what terrified me most was not the fact that Martin might be out there lurking, but that I no longer knew what to do. Every strategy I took seemed to be based on assumptions, on conjecture. Was this the price of having trusted someone so close? The price of having underestimated what a person was capable of doing for revenge? And above all, something had snapped inside me. I could no longer ignore it. I was no longer the same person who had started this story. I had been marked by distrust, by a constant sense of danger. I no longer knew if I could ever regain my peace. Every night, when the sound of the storm mixes with the creaking of doors and windows, I wonder if I will ever be able to feel safe again. The lesson I learned, in the most painful way, is that the biggest threats don't always come from the most obvious places. Sometimes the most dangerous threat is so close that you don't see it until it's too late. It was one of those nights when the storm seems to want to swallow the world. The sound of the rain pounding against the roof of my car felt deafening, and the lights on the road barely penetrated the darkness. I left the party late, much later than I had planned, but the fun had dragged me to the last moment. I was tired, yes, but somehow I didn't want it to end. I didn't want to go back to my usual life. That feeling of freedom, of being surrounded by friends and laughter, made me forget the routine and tedium of my daily existence. The street I was returning home on was the same as always. For the past 15 years, he had taken the same road, passing the same houses, the same trees, the same lonely corners that often faded into darkness. At that time of night, everything was empty. Only the car headlights illuminated the wet, slippery asphalt. I had never felt uncomfortable on this road before. It was my route, my territory. But that night, something felt strange. Suddenly, my car started to make a noise, like a small mechanical growl. The sound distracted me for a moment, but I didn't give it any importance. I thought it was silly, that as the miles went by, everything would resolve itself. But it didn't. The car began to misfire more and more. The engine stuttered and cut out all at once. I tried to start it again, but there was no way. I was left in the middle of the road, soaked by the rain, in a place so isolated that not even the lights of the nearby houses could reach me. I looked around. Everything was dark. The rain didn't stop. I could hardly believe what was happening. I had been on that road hundreds of times, but now it seemed like a completely different place. There was something in the air, something I couldn't identify in coverage bar, but reeked down. Something. The clock was ticking, and I impatiently began to think of the worst possibilities. Worst of all, I didn't know how much time had passed. If I looked at the clock, I saw minutes, but those minutes seemed eternal. Every second dragged by. Every raindrop hitting the glass made me think something, or someone, was approaching. Everything seemed distorted. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I saw a light in the distance. It was a headlight, a distant headlight that got closer as the rain intensified. At first I thought it was the tow truck I had called, but as the light got closer, I realized it was not the tow truck vehicle. It was an unfamiliar car, coming from the same direction as me, moving slowly, almost as if it was in no hurry. My heart began to beat faster. Something inside me was telling me that I shouldn't stay there, that I should leave, but something was holding me still, as if an invisible force was holding me to the place. The car stopped in front of me, and a shadow fell from inside. A man, about 40 years old, appeared in front of me. He was not carrying an umbrella or anything to protect him from the pouring rain. His figure was silhouetted in the darkness, and the only thing I could clearly make out was his tense, rigid posture. The man was looking in my direction, as if he was waiting for me to do something. I watched him for a few seconds. Something about his attitude made me deeply uncomfortable. Something was not right with him. I could feel it in the way he was watching me, in the posture of his shoulders, in the fact that he didn't come a step closer. It was as if he was waiting for something, and worst of all, I didn't know exactly what it was. My mind was trying to find a logical explanation, but fear was already taking over. Despite being in the pouring rain, feeling vulnerable and trapped, I couldn't move. Something was telling me that this man had not appeared by chance. My instinct was screaming at me that I should run, that I should do something to protect myself. But I couldn't. Fear paralyzed me. I was trapped in a dark place with no signs, no help, no escape. The man took a step towards me and my heart raced even faster. My whole body was tense. My fingers clenched the steering wheel tightly. My eyes couldn't take my eyes off his figure. He didn't need to speak for me to understand what he wanted. Something in his gaze, in the way he approached me, told me that his intention was not good. In the blink of an eye, the circumstance was transformed. Suddenly, I was surrounded by that oppressive atmosphere that grew with every second. The rain was hitting the roof of the car hard, and the sound of the drops was the only thing I could hear, until I felt the pressure in the air become unbearable. The man came closer, and the worst thing was that I couldn't react. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I couldn't defend myself. The man seemed to have a precise knowledge of what he was doing. He showed no signs of hurry, as if everything was under control, as if he had experienced situations like this before. A cold sweat broke out on my back as I realized that this man was not someone who simply needed help or wanted to talk. No, he was there with only one intention: to steal from me. He wanted to take everything I had, and he would do it no matter what I had to do to get it. And so it was. The fear I felt at that moment was not just fear of the unknown. It was a sense of absolute vulnerability, of having no control, of being at the mercy of a stranger on a deserted road, with no one to help me. The man took my wallet, my phone, my keys. He emptied my pockets, and I, completely paralyzed with fear, could do nothing. I couldn't even think clearly. I couldn't defend myself. At that instant, something inside me exploded. My body did not react. I was trapped in that paralyzing fear, unable to do anything while the man took what he wanted. Before leaving, he pushed me into the car seat and sped away, as if it was all part of a game that only he understood. I stood there, alone, in the rain, in the dark, my heart pounding violently in my chest. I couldn't stop reflecting on what had just happened, what I had lost. That night, something changed inside me. The feeling of being safe in this world vanished. Everything I thought I knew about life, about the control I had over it, collapsed in that instant. I was no longer the same, and the road, my house, everything I once knew, now seemed unrecognizable. Time passed, and what happened that night in the car was not something I could shake off so easily. Although on the surface, the next few hours seemed normal, fear remained a constant guest in my mind. The worst part was that I didn't know how to escape it. The world no longer felt the same. Not the streets, not the people, not even my own home. There was something intangible that haunted me, something that clung to my skin and my shadow and would never leave. At first I tried to pretend nothing had happened. I restrained myself in my work, in my daily life, but I couldn't stop remembering that empty look of the man, his slow, sure step, as if he had been waiting for that moment for years. The time I spent away from home seemed endless, and every time I returned, I felt like someone was watching me from the shadows. I did not dare to tell anyone what I had experienced. How could I explain it? How could I tell anyone that I was unable to defend myself? That I was at the mercy of a man who was not afraid to do what he wanted with me? But the worst came later, when the memories of that night began to rumble in my mind at all hours. I couldn't sleep, and when I did, fear would spill over into my dreams. I would see the man again, not only stealing my things, but watching me from the corners of my house, in every dark room, in every corner I looked into. I could not escape his presence. The echoes of his footsteps echoed in my mind, like an endless condemnation. For days the storm seemed to go on and on. The rain kept lashing the windows of my house, and the sky was tinged with a dull gray that gave no respite. The sound of the drops hitting the glass haunted me, constantly reminding me of what had happened. Every time the drops hit the glass, my heart raced. The fear was becoming bigger than me, a shadow that would not fade. I could not stay in that place. The feeling of insecurity was becoming more and more unbearable. I decided that the best thing to do was to move. I could no longer live in the house I had shared for so many years, nor in the streets I knew too well, now turned into a territory full of invisible threats. I thought that maybe a change of environment, a new house, a new city, would give me the peace I needed so much. But what I didn't know was that the fear I had experienced that night was not dependent on the location. It was not the place that unsettled me, but the shadow of what had happened. The move was not easy. The process of packing my things, of deciding what to take and what to leave behind, became a difficult task. Not because of the objects, not because of the material things, but because of the weight of what each one of them represented. Each object seemed to be impregnated with the memory of what had happened. The TV that had seen the news that night, the lamp by the window where I had sat my phone, even the shoes I wore when I went out partying. Everything was taking me back to that moment. Everything dragged me back to helplessness, to the feeling of being an easy target, of being at the mercy of a world I didn't understand. By moving, I thought my mind would find some relief, but the fear persisted. It was as if that man's presence was still hovering in the air, lurking, waiting. Every time I went outside, I felt like someone was watching me. When I arrived at my new house, the feeling of being watched intensified. No one had followed me. There was no evidence that the man was nearby, but the anxiety would not go away. My mind played tricks on me, imagining shadows in every corner, in every window. What was once a refuge now seemed like a prison to me. The worst was the feeling of being unable to trust anyone. The people around me, the friends, the friendships that were once close seemed distant. I had distanced myself from them, gradually isolating myself in a world that existed only in my head. No one could understand what I had lived through, and even if they tried, they could not grasp the magnitude of the terror that gripped me. How to explain that a single encounter, a single moment, had destroyed my perception of safety? How to tell anyone that my life was no longer the same, that fear had gone from being a simple sensation to becoming a constant companion? The rain continued to fall for weeks. That constant presence of storm, of darkness, never left me. Even when the sun began to rise, the oppressive feeling would not go away. The days were gray, the tallest buildings seemed to crumble above me, and the sound of the rain became a constant cacophony in my mind. I would stay at home with the windows closed, lights off, because outside, in the real world, something told me I was not safe. Sometimes, even during the day, I seemed to see a shadow move out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned around, there was nothing. Paranoia began to take hold of me. I walked the streets in fear, constantly looking back, checking my rearview mirrors as if I expected to see the silhouette of the man who had attacked me. The nights became a torment. I would wake up sweating, my heart pounding, the feeling of being chased as if the man was close by, waiting for the right moment to attack me again. I no longer knew what was real and what was a figment of my mind. My thoughts were falling apart, and I found it increasingly difficult to distinguish between the past and the present. One day, after weeks of anguish, I decided that I could no longer live in this cycle. I had to face what had happened. I had to get out of the hole I had dug myself into. I made the decision to return to the place where it had all started, where I had been robbed, where I had lost more than my belongings. I returned to the street where my car had stopped, the dark, rain-soaked street where that shadow first materialized. Standing there, I felt strange. The fear was not as acute as before, but it was still present. I looked at the houses, the trees, the road I had walked so many times. Everything looked the same, and yet everything had changed. I stood there for a long time, watching the rain continue to fall, like an invisible curtain separating the old me from the new me. I understood something important at that moment. It wasn't about changing places, about escaping memory or shadows. It was about facing what had happened, about recognizing that fear is not easily dissolved or forgotten. On the contrary, fear becomes part of you, something you must learn to manage, to recognize, to live with it, without letting it control you. When I returned home, I no longer felt that oppression. I had made peace with what had happened. I accepted that life is not controllable, that we are not always safe, and that the shadows will always be there, lurking. But the real challenge is to learn to live with them, without allowing them to destroy us. And that was the lesson I learned that night. Life, as scary as it can be at times, will never stop moving forward. It's just up to us how we respond to the dark moments. If we allow ourselves to be consumed by fear, we will be lost in the darkness. If we face our shadows, even if it is with fear, we will move forward. I remember that afternoon perfectly. The sky was covered with dark clouds, and the sound of the rain pounding against the windows was incessant. It was a heavy storm, one of those that envelop you with its roar and make you feel the discomfort in every corner of the house. I had finally decided to change jobs. It had been a decision I had pondered for months. The previous job was eating me up, and it was clear that I needed a change. Something that would allow me to get out of the routine, that would make me feel alive again. I found a new opportunity that excited me, where working with people and interacting with them on a daily basis offered me a breath of fresh air. However, Clara did not understand my decision. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. But as the weeks progressed, things began to change. She began to feel uncomfortable with my new friendships and the amount of time I was spending away from home. Small arguments started to turn into something bigger. It didn't take long for insecurity to creep in, that feeling that something wasn't right. And the more I tried to explain it to her, the more she became immersed in her own fears. "I don't trust that everything is all right," she would say to me, although she never expressed it clearly. You could see in her eyes that something was eating her up inside. The distance between us was growing, though I didn't want to see it. At first, I tried to ignore it. I thought they were just passing concerns, something couples go through at certain times. But as the days went by, her words became more intense. She started telling me that if anything happened to her, it would be because of me, that everything was changing around her, and she couldn't stand it. "I don't know what I would do without you," she would say, in a tone that left me uneasy. The worst thing was that I began to feel trapped, as if the distance between us was a weight I could not free myself from. Every time I came home, she would look at me with an expression I couldn't understand. There was something in that look, a mixture of sadness and fear that overwhelmed me. I didn't feel like myself. She wasn't the woman I knew, and I wasn't the man I was before. The relationship had changed, and worst of all, neither of us seemed to know how to stop the transformation. At night, when everything calmed down, the storm continued inside me. I tried to do the right thing, to calm her down, but I couldn't. Each attempt was an effort that vanished in a sea of doubts. Each attempt was an effort that vanished in a sea of doubts. I could no longer cope with this constant tension, with this fear of the next confrontation. It was then that I made a difficult decision. I proposed to her that we take some time, that she give space to her pain, that we try to understand what was happening to us. But Clara did not accept it. And what followed, even I could not predict. The rain continued to fall relentlessly. The city, normally so noisy, was now plunged into a heavy silence. Every drop hitting the ground, every sound of the wind whipping against the windows, made me feel more and more distant, more and more lost in the tangle of my thoughts. The storm seemed to have come with a purpose, as if everything that had happened between Clara and me was being washed away by nature's fury. I couldn't help thinking that maybe it was too late. When I received the text message from his mother, something inside me shuddered. There was something in the tone of her words that made me hesitate. The urgency in her message was clear, but I didn't understand what could really be going on. I wasn't prepared to face what I was about to encounter, but at the same time, I couldn't stand still. I needed to go. I needed to see with my own eyes if everything was okay, even though I knew that the storm that raged in our relationship had already passed the line of no return. The drive to her apartment was long. Although I lived nearby, that day it seemed like the streets would never end. The car headlights only illuminated the darkness, and the water ran down the sidewalks as if it was trying to drag me with it, as if it was trying to push me towards a destiny I could not avoid. Every minute that passed, I felt the weight of my indecision. At every corner, at every red light, I saw reflected a missed opportunity. A word I didn't say, a look I let slip away. But there was no turning back. Clara was gone. When I arrived at the building, the atmosphere was tense, charged with an uneasy feeling that swept through my body. The rain did not let up, and as I opened the door to the building, the cold crept into my bones. I walked up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. Every sound I made seemed to multiply, as if the place was watching me, waiting. The last time I was there, Clara was in her room, with the same warm energy that characterized her. But now it was all just a distant echo. When I arrived at the door of her apartment, her mother was waiting for me, but neither her look nor her body betrayed comfort. There was only concern and something else. I couldn't immediately identify it, but it was clear that the silence was heavier than ever. We went in. The place was the same as always, but the atmosphere was completely different. The furniture, the walls, the objects that had once witnessed laughter and shared moments were now submerged in a dense atmosphere. The air felt sticky, cold, as if I was trapped in an invisible current that made me deeply uncomfortable. I walked down the hallway, unwillingly, but at the same time unable to help myself. As I approached Clara's room, each step felt like my last. Memories of all the times we had shared those spaces invaded my mind and filled me with a sadness I couldn't quite understand. The memories of the last time I was there, when she looked at me with those eyes full of fear and anxiety, now weighed on me like a slab. I opened the door to his room, and then I saw him. Clara was there, lying on the bed. At first I could not process it. I approached slowly, as if I could still wake up from some nightmare, as if her figure on the bed was nothing more than an illusion. But as I got closer, I saw the letter in his hands, and I understood everything. In her eyes there was no more life. It was as if, with her last breath, she had tried to say everything she could not say while she was alive. The letter was handwritten. with strokes that hinted at the pain of someone who had lost hope. I took the letter in my trembling hands, and as I read the words, my heart stopped for an instant. It said, "I loved you more than you could ever understand. I always knew this wouldn't last, but I couldn't do anything. It wasn't your fault. I just couldn't go on anymore." The weight of those words fell on me like an unbearable burden. I stood there at her bedside, staring at the letter, unable to move. The sound of the rain outside was the only thing that seemed to make sense, a distant murmur that contrasted with the silence in the room. What could I do at that moment? Was there anything I could have said or done to change the direction our relationship had taken? Doubt consumed me as I looked at her face. What I saw there was not only the end of a life, but a reflection of the anguish I had gone through during our last months together. What weighed on me most, however, was the feeling that maybe, just maybe, all of this could have been avoided. I thought of all the times I tried to talk to her, to explain that my changes were not a betrayal, but a search for something that would make me feel fulfilled, something that would allow me to find myself again. But all that was lost in the air, vanished in the face of her fears, her insecurities. The love we once shared had become a burden for both of us, an emotional prison from which we could not escape. And most painful of all, I failed to see what was happening. I am not the same after that. The image of Clara in that bed, the letter she left behind, still haunt me, though not as obviously as before. Now, when I face my own feelings, I realize that I am no longer the person I was before that day. Something in me broke into pieces so small that I will never be able to pick them all up. My heart, though it still beats, carries a scar that cannot heal. As I left the apartment, the weight of guilt followed me like a shadow. The storm outside seemed to have calmed down a bit, but inside me, everything was still raining with the same intensity. There was no way to escape from what had happened, and life, in its unstoppable course, was moving on. Over time, I have come to realize that relationships are not simply two people crossing paths in life. They are deep interactions that require time, patience, understanding, and above all, attention. When we don't pay attention to the signals, when we allow ourselves to be consumed by our own insecurities or fears, the consequences can be devastating. Clara's story is a painful reminder that indifference should never be an option. The relationship, although with beautiful moments, was marked by emotional abandonment, lack of communication, and inability to listen. In the end, silences were stronger than words, and the distance between us became an abyss from which we could not return. What Clara lived, what she suffered, has no way back. And I, who never imagined I would be the last to see her pain, carry that lesson with me. Never expect too much. Life doesn't always give you second chances, and words can't always mend what is broken. Now, I am a different man. Not better, not worse, but different. The storm has passed, but its shadow is still there, in every corner of my being. I remember it well. It was a gray and rainy afternoon when I decided to turn my life around. I had spent so much time anchored to routine in that job that did not satisfy me, surrounded by the same people, the same faces, and the same empty conversations. The atmosphere was not bad, but I felt that my life was sliding like a river, without direction. And in the midst of all that, I decided I needed something different, a new direction, a job change, a chance to interact more with people, to get out of my comfort zone. It was an impulsive, yet thoughtful decision. I felt like I had been waiting for the perfect moment, and that day, with the rain pounding on the window and the feeling that the world was crumbling around me, I felt I couldn't wait any longer. So I did. I quit my old job and accepted an offer from a company with more contact with the public. It was an opportunity I had been unknowingly waiting for, an open door to the unknown. What I did not anticipate, however, was how everything would change for Eduardo, my best friend since childhood. Eduardo and I shared a solid friendship, or so I thought. We had been together since the first day of school. We had faced our fears, our insecurities, and every important moment in our lives. We were inseparable, At first, he supported me in my decision to change jobs, congratulated me, and even seemed excited for me. However, as the days passed, something began to change in him. I noticed something wasn't right. The first signs were subtle, but over time they became impossible to ignore. When I would meet up with other friends, Eduardo would start to become more distant. He was no longer as willing to accompany me on outings, nor as interested in our old conversations. At first, I thought it was just a phase, that maybe he was busy with his life. However, time passed, and those little gestures of indifference accumulated. We were no longer the same. Eduardo began to show jealousy, although in such a subtle way that I hardly noticed it at first. It was the kind of jealousy that was disguised with jokes or indirect comments. He would talk to me about the new friends I was meeting at my new job, insinuating that I no longer had time for him. He would say that he didn't understand why I needed to be around so many people, as if that was something that would take me away from him. It was at that moment that I began to realize that something much deeper was going on. At first, I thought it was just a passing phase. After all, friendships sometimes go through ups and downs, but good relationships always manage to overcome any obstacles, don't they? I thought so. However, the days passed and the situation worsened. The comments, although still disguised as jokes, began to take on a more aggressive tone. Eduardo complained that I was spending more time with other people, that we were no longer as inseparable as before. He told me once, in a tone I didn't know how to interpret, "It seems that now you care more about what you do with them than what you and I do." Despite the obvious signs that our relationship was changing, I refused to believe that things were really deteriorating. I believed that, in the end, everything would work out if I just carried on with my life as I always had. However, something began to prick my conscience. Eduardo was no longer the same, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of his frustration beginning to weigh on me. I was not doing justice to our friendship by simply ignoring his attitudes. But what could I do? How could I explain to him that my life was changing, that I needed to move on, and that his behavior was affecting our relationship? I decided not to make a big deal of it at first. I thought that in time things would calm down. What I didn't know was that while I was focused on my new life, Eduardo was sinking deeper into his own sea of insecurities and jealousy. Every time I went out with other friends, I felt his eyes following me, as if he was evaluating me, measuring my every move. I started receiving strange messages. Sometimes they were simple questions about what I was doing or where I was. Other times they were hints about the people I was with. It became so obvious that I could no longer ignore it. I didn't want to accept that someone with whom I had shared so many years of friendship could become obsessed in this way. There were nights when, after talking to him, I felt more tired than ever. It was no longer just the job change that was affecting me. Now the relationship with Eduardo had become an emotional burden. The times I tried to make him see the absurdity of his jealousy, he would simply close in on himself, as if somehow he was the victim in all of this. His words didn't reach me like they used to. What was once a solid friendship had now become a subtle psychological warfare, a power struggle in which we were both unwitting players. Worst of all was the fear that began to take hold of me. It was not physical fear, as one might expect, but a deeper, more insidious fear. I began to feel that any misstep, any gesture that wasn't the right one, could unleash something much more serious. There were nights when I would wake up with the feeling that Eduardo was watching me from somewhere, lurking in the shadows of my life, waiting for a mistake, an excuse to get out of control. It was then that I realized that everything I had been building up inside me could no longer be ignored. My life was being absorbed by something I could no longer handle. Eduardo was no longer just my friend. He had become a subtle threat, a constant reminder of my own fears and doubts. And worst of all, I no longer knew if what I was experiencing was the beginning of the end or simply the end of what was once a true friendship. The decision to confront him weighed on my shoulders like an iron slab. Days went by, and I could not get any rest. The feeling that something was wrong wouldn't let me sleep, and in the end, that uncomfortable feeling became a constant pain. I was no longer able to ignore it. In every corner of my life, in every conversation with friends, Eduardo had become a shadow, an intangible but always palpable presence that never faded. The streets where I used to walk safely now seemed alien, dangerous. The places we used to frequent together no longer made sense. Pain, guilt, and fear followed me like ghosts, even if I couldn't see them. One afternoon, I finally decided that I was going to stand up to him, no matter how late it was. I could no longer live with the uncertainty. I needed clarity, even if it meant losing him forever. I had to talk to him, set a boundary, and give myself the space I needed to move forward. But fear consumed me, not for what he might do, but for what I might be able to do myself. In that moment, I realized that it wasn't just him who had changed. I had too. I was scared, too scared, of the person I had become. I stepped outside into the torrential rain, which seemed to fall with renewed fury, as if the sky was responding to my own fears. The drops hit my face hard, and the sound of the storm filled the air, creating a sense of absolute isolation. Every step I took on the deserted street brought me closer to a point of no return. The echoes of my own footsteps made me feel as if I were the only human being in the world. Finally, I arrived at his house. The storm had not let up, and the place looked even gloomier under the weight of dark clouds. The dim light from a lamp in the foyer flickered through the window, as if struggling to survive the chaos outside. I knocked on the door firmly, but also with a sense of uncertainty that I could not control. It was done. I was determined to face everything that had built up inside me for so long. But, at the same time, I wondered if I had done the right thing. If I was prepared for what was going to happen after that conversation. When the door opened, Eduardo appeared. His face was tense, thinner than I remembered, and his gaze, that look that used to be so familiar and warm, was now cold and distant, as if he no longer knew who I was. He didn't say anything to me at first. He just looked at me, as if he was assessing whether I was worth listening to, or whether he should throw me out of there immediately. Discomfort filled the space between us, like a swollen river that could not be stopped. I invited him to take the step we both knew needed to be taken. I looked into his eyes with an anxious feeling in my chest, unable to escape the tension building up between us. Eduardo seemed to know what was coming, and I knew it too. There was no turning back. He didn't react immediately. The words I was searching for to explain how I felt, to explain to him how everything that had started as a friendship had turned into something distressing and toxic, didn't seem to emerge. The pressure in my chest increased, and for a moment, I felt like I was drowning in my own thoughts. I remember that, in the midst of that uncomfortable silence, I heard the sound of the rain intensifying even more. The rumbling of thunder outside the house seemed like a harbinger of things to come. Each bolt of lightning that lit up the sky was like a wake-up call, a warning that things that were about to happen would not be easy. Finally, Eduardo broke the silence. But his words were not what he expected. His eyes, previously empty of emotion, were now filled with an unsettling intensity. He spoke of his insecurities, how he had come to feel abandoned, how his mind was filled with jealousy and doubt. Although he didn't say it explicitly, what he was suggesting was that our friendship had been only a refuge for him, an escape, and that my change had uncovered a void he couldn't fill. Of course, everything he said had a mixture of sadness and frustration, but at that moment I realized that it was not only his pain that dominated the situation, but also his control over me. He had managed to make me feel responsible for his suffering. He had manipulated my own feelings, making me feel guilty for changing, for living my life. It was then that the pressure in my chest became unbearable. I knew I had to put an end to this conversation, but it was not clear to me how to do it. I was caught in an emotional whirlwind, and words were slipping away, as if they weren't enough to unravel the tangle of confusion in which we had become entangled. I wanted to escape, but I knew I couldn't leave it at that. I stayed there, in his house, for longer than I should have. The minutes seemed like hours. The rain kept falling, and all I could think about was how I had gotten to this point. Of all that it had meant to me, and even though everything was telling me that I should leave, that I should put an emphatic end to it, I stayed because I couldn't let it go so easily. Even with everything that had happened, Eduardo was still my friend, even though that friendship was broken. I got up from the chair, and although my mind screamed to run away, my feet did not move as fast as my body desired. Eduardo looked at me, without another word, as if there was nothing left to say. The emptiness in his face was now a reflection of the distance between us. The storm outside, which had once seemed to me a symbol of chaos, was now only a reflection of the storm still raging inside me. The emptiness that had remained between us was the same emptiness that had grown inside me. When I left his house, the rain had not stopped. I felt lighter, but also more trapped. I had broken something I couldn't rebuild, and try as I might, I knew we were no longer the same. The storm of emotions still raged inside me, and the uncertainty of whether I had made the right decision continued to haunt me, like a shadow that would never dissipate. That night, upon returning home, I realized something I hadn't realized until then. People change, and sometimes those changes are irreparable. Sometimes the greatest pain is not losing someone, but realizing that that person is no longer who he or she used to be. What I experienced with Eduardo left an indelible mark, not only in my heart, but also in my perception of human relationships. The lesson was clear. We cannot always save what is already broken. Sometimes, life takes us down paths we had not anticipated, and even if we want to avoid the pain, the process of letting someone go can be more painful than we imagined. Today I know that, although the storm has passed, there is no return. What was is no more, and what remains, although painful, is only a shadow of the past. Relationships, no matter how much they hurt, are part of our growth process, and learning to let go of what is not good for us is one of the greatest acts of courage we can do. It had been a long day. After an exhausting day's work, I decided to take the usual route home. Night had fallen quickly and the street lights were beginning to flicker with an intermittent yellowish light, which barely managed to penetrate the deep darkness of the road. The sound of the rain hitting the windshield of my car was constant, and the wind, howling as if it wanted to tear the branches off the trees, created a strange atmosphere, as if something was not right in the air. However, I ignored it, concentrating on the road, seeking only to get home and rest. I took the highway, which was usually empty at that hour. I didn't like driving there at night, but I didn't have much choice. I just wanted to get home soon. Suddenly, something caught my attention. In the distance, I could see flashing lights. I thought it was a police car. I wasn't surprised, as the area is known for having nighttime security checks. What did surprise me was the way those lights were moving, as if the patrol car was circling, waiting for something. An uneasy feeling began to form in my stomach. As I got closer, I noticed that the place where the vehicles were stopped did not seem quite appropriate. There was no clear signage, no signs indicating that it was a regular roadblock, but my thoughts were quickly interrupted by a burst of rain that almost clouded my vision. It was enough for my usually reliable intuition to alert me. Something wasn't right, but it was too late to turn back. As I approached, the car in front of me had already passed, and the figure of a man appeared on the threshold of the road. A policeman. That's what I thought at first. It didn't seem unusual for a patrol car to be there, considering the rain was getting worse and visibility was minimal. I slowed down and pulled over, expecting to be asked for some kind of check. The agent approached quickly, and his movements were not those of someone going through a routine checkpoint. There was something unsettling about the way he approached, as if he was in a hurry for something. His face was partially covered by the hood of his jacket, but his eyes were shining with an intensity that did not leave me at ease. Rain was falling all around him, creating little bursts of water with every step he took on the asphalt. At that moment, I thought everything was normal, just a routine situation. However, the conversation did not go the way I expected it to. The policeman did not stop to ask for my documents or ask the usual questions. Instead, he just stared at me with an expression I could not identify. I, not knowing why, tried to calm down and not think too much about it. Maybe I was tired, or maybe it was just my imagination. The feeling of discomfort only increased. The policeman, as if he noticed my discomfort, took a step back and looked towards the two cars that were parked in the distance, in a position that seemed a bit strange to me. At that moment, I noticed that there were no emergency lights, nor the typical signaling cones. Something was wrong, but before I could react, two other men approached from the darkness. I hadn't seen them before, and at that precise moment, I realized I had made a mistake. The man approaching me was not a policeman, far from it. He was a criminal in disguise. My mind immediately panicked. The man motioned for me to roll down the window, but I didn't dare move. I knew something wasn't right, that something serious was going to happen, but the paralysis of fear had completely overtaken me. I could not speak. I could not react. Something in his gaze, in the way he moved, made me realize that I was in a trap, and it was too late to get out. The other man who had appeared out of the darkness approached from my side with an overly quick and professional gesture. I could no longer escape. The feeling of being trapped in a deadly situation grew in my chest. I thought that at any moment one of them was going to pull out a gun, yell at me, demand money, or worse. But they didn't. Instead, they simply got into the car and began to search it, emptying the glove compartment, the back seat, and the center console drawers. The rain continued to fall, each drop hitting the windshield as if it were a clock ticking away the seconds. I was completely immobilized, watching, unable to move. Minutes passed, and time seemed to drag on endlessly. The men said nothing. They didn't need to. I knew what was happening. I was being robbed. My belongings, my money, my phone, everything was slowly disappearing. Fear grew in my chest with each item they took. That's when one of them came to my window. There was nothing to do. I felt fear choking me. The guy leaned forward and I could see his eyes, cold and empty. He had no face, no emotion, just an absolute emptiness. My hands were shaking, my heart was pounding, and a cold sweat covered my forehead. There was no turning back. What had started as a simple police check had turned into a nightmare I could never have imagined. When they finally finished, the three men calmly walked away. It all happened so fast, but the tension in my body remained. I got out of the car with my legs shaking, my mind blank. I couldn't understand how I had gone so far, how I had trusted a scene that seemed so routine and so harmless. The sound of the rain now seemed like a constant pounding in my ears. I felt the weight of loneliness and fear enveloping me. The lights of the cars, which had seemed so familiar to me before, now seemed distant, unreachable. When I finally picked up the phone and called the police, I felt no consolation. They told me they couldn't do much, that there were no more traces left, that they couldn't find those responsible. I didn't care. I knew I would never see my money or my things again. But what bothered me most was how something so simple, something so everyday, could have dragged me into that nightmare. I was no longer calm. I no longer trusted anything. I did not stop again in unidentified alcoves, but my paranoia grew. Every time I saw a car stopped on the road, fear gripped me. Nothing would ever be the same. And the worst part was that inside, I knew I would never be the same again. The days that followed that incident passed slowly. The fear was still in me, but it had morphed into something more subtle, something that haunted me on a mental level, something I couldn't help but feel, even though it was no longer in sight. I couldn't help but look over my shoulder every time I entered a new place. Every car parked on the side of the road became a potential threat, a reminder of how close I came to losing everything. My trust in life, in people, had completely vanished. Worst of all, I knew that deep down, it was always going to be like this. There was something dark in the world, something invisible, and now I had touched it with my own hands. I remember that the rain began to intensify again, as if the sky decided to synchronize with my thoughts. That night, the sky was completely overcast. No moon, no stars. The darkness was so dense that it seemed as if the whole world was trying to swallow everything that existed. At first, the rain offered me some comfort, as if the drops falling on the roof of my house could clear my mind of the images of the thief's empty face. But soon its sound became a constant pressure in my ears, a kind of murmur that enveloped me, reminding me that the threat was still present. I decided to leave my house in the middle of the night, when most of the streets were deserted and the city was asleep. I wanted to walk, to think, to put my mind in order. The cold cut my skin, and the rain, like an endless curtain, soaked my clothes. The streetlights were dim, creating long, ghostly shadows that danced in the wind. But it didn't matter. I had no intention of returning. My mind was trapped in a cycle, and all I could do was walk, while my brain tried to find some kind of logic in all this. How had I been so naive? Why had I trusted those men in that scene that seemed so normal? With every step I took, the feeling that someone was watching me grew. At first, I attributed it to fear, to the paranoia that gripped me. But as I walked through the lonely streets, that feeling became a certainty. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like something or someone was following me, getting closer. Every car I passed on the street caused me a surge of anxiety. Could it be them? The same men from the Alabala? My mind kept wondering if this was just the beginning of something worse. The thought that they had marked me, that they had been following me since the incident, was constantly running through me. It was no longer just a robbery. Now, it all seemed part of a larger threat, something more sinister. Suddenly, I heard a noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but something inside me told me it was not. The sound was coming from a nearby street, as if someone was walking behind me, just at the distance where I couldn't see him. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it was my mind playing tricks. But then I heard the sound again, this time closer. The footsteps were approaching calmly, meticulously, as if they were waiting for me to notice. I decided to pick up the pace, without looking back. My breathing became agitated, sweat blurred my eyes. The rain was coming down hard, but I couldn't concentrate on the sound of the water on the asphalt. I was too focused on what was behind me. Tension gripped my body as the shadows seemed to lengthen and surround me. I felt that someone, or something, was getting closer and closer. It was at that moment that something else happened. The footsteps stopped. The silence became absolute, as if the city itself had suspended its breathing. My mind went on full alert. I turned suddenly, looking out onto the empty street, the lights of the street lamps illuminating a desolate space. Nothing. No one was there. Yet the feeling of being watched was still there, strong and unsettling. I looked everywhere, searching for any sign, any movement, but I saw nothing. My heart was still pounding. I decided to turn around again and continue walking, faster than before, until I felt the need to return home, to return to a place that no longer offered me security, but at least gave me some sense of control. Every step I took, I felt the weight of fear settle more on my shoulders. It wasn't just the rain that was soaking me now, but the sweat of anguish. Someone was stalking me. I didn't know who, but I felt it deeply. When I reached my door, the anxiety was so thick that I could hardly find the key to open it. Once inside, I closed the door behind me with a loud bang, and although the house was safe, something inside me told me that the danger had never left. I could hear my breath hitching, each exhale echoing in my ears. The rain continued outside, relentless, pounding on the windows. But now, it didn't seem comforting. Now, The sound of the falling drops was like a reminder of the chaos I had unleashed. It was a sign that the threat would never go away, that the memories of the incident would continue to haunt me. And worst of all, I knew that somehow, all of this could have been avoided if I hadn't been so trusting, if I hadn't carried on with my life as if nothing had happened. Now, with the certainty that something had broken inside me, I began to understand the true nature of my paranoia. Fear was not only the result of what had happened that night, but a shadow that had settled in my life to stay. I had been a victim of my own trust, of my own naivete, and the lesson was crueler than I could have imagined. But something else had been unleashed inside me. Although I never knew for sure if those men had followed me, or if my mind was playing a cruel joke on me, the fear had left an indelible mark. I could no longer ignore it. I could no longer return to the same life I had before. The roadblocks that once seemed like simple security checkpoints were now places of danger. The streetlights were no longer beacons of guidance, but warnings. And worst of all, I knew that at some point, my life would be completely transformed by that shadow of distrust that, sooner or later, would consume all that was left of me. We often live our lives guided by a false sense of security, believing that nothing bad will happen until we are suddenly confronted with the fragility of our existence. Trust, that which leads us to trust our surroundings and people, is also our greatest vulnerability. How many of us really pay attention to the warning signs the world gives us? In a world full of shadows and chaos, the line between safety and danger is finer than we think. And sometimes, fear comes not in the form we expect, but in the unsettling stillness that grips our minds when we realize that nothing will ever be the same again. The rain was pounding the window pane furiously. I could hear the drops crashing against the glass with an almost desperate force, as if trying to escape the storm. Outside, everything was plunged into opaque darkness, with the streetlights barely illuminating the shadows crawling along the sodden ground. I was alone in my house, as I always was after work. I didn't like the solitude, but it was all I had left. I remember that day, an ordinary day, or so I thought at first. I'd spent the whole day at the office, attending clients, dealing with reports, and thinking about how the daily routine had been eating me up little by little. When I finally got home, the first thing I did was change my clothes, change into something more comfortable, and sit down on the couch with a drink in my hand. I loved the quietness of my home after the daily hustle and bustle. But something had changed. In the neighborhood, it was always peaceful. It was the kind of neighborhood where people greeted each other cordially, where cars didn't speed by, and people knew each other. But that calm crumbled a little over a month ago when a new neighbor moved in. A middle-aged man with an appearance that seemed to fit the mold of someone normal, but who from the first moment gave me a strange feeling. His eyes, dark and somewhat vacant, always seemed to be watching something beyond the obvious. It wasn't paranoia. There was something about him that didn't add up. At first, his presence was discreet. I hardly saw him, except for the strange noises coming from his house at night. Sometimes it sounded like he was dragging furniture or moving something heavily inside. I didn't pay too much attention to him. We all have our quirks, I thought. But what happened next changed everything. One night, as I was sitting in the living room, watching the rain through the window, I heard a knocking on my door. At first I thought it was the wind, but the sound became more persistent, somewhat louder. I got up with a slight feeling of uneasiness and went to open it. When I opened the door, I found the man from the next house. There was no reason for me to be surprised to see him there, but something about his posture made me uncomfortable. He was soaking wet, as if he had been in the rain for hours. He stared at me, saying nothing at first. His expression was expressionless, almost vacant, as if he had no real interest in what I was about to say. "Can you help me with something?" he asked, although it didn't sound like he was really asking for assistance. I watched him in silence, not knowing what to respond. At that moment, there was nothing particularly strange in his request, only the monotonous tone of his voice. However, something in his gaze made me hesitate. "I don't have power in the house," he finally said, as if it didn't matter whether he believed it or not. "I want to know if you could provide me with a cable to link to your home network." It was a strange request. It was unusual for someone to ask for help in that way, but I offered him the cable without hesitation, although a part of me felt that there was something not quite normal in his attitude. His gaze remained fixed on my eyes, as if he was looking for something inside me, something that I could not identify, but that made me even more uncomfortable. As I handed him the cable, I noticed something strange about his hands. They were dirty, but not only because of dirt or dust. They were dark stains, somewhat slimy, as if he had been touching something he shouldn't have. For a moment, I thought maybe he had been working on something in his house, and I didn't look too closely at the details. But, as I walked back into my house, a shiver ran down my spine. The rain was pounding harder and harder, and my thoughts were swirling in my mind. As the days went by, something kept hanging around in my head. My neighbor's attitude, the stains on his hands, his cold and distant stare. It all stayed with me, even when I didn't want to think about it. The silence of the neighborhood grew heavier as the weeks passed. Strange noises in her house became more frequent, and sometimes it even seemed like I heard low voices, murmurs, coming from her home. At first I tried to ignore it, thinking that maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks, but the truth is that I couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. Something about that man. Something I didn't want to see or understand. One night, while I was at home, the rain intensified. The storm raged with such force that the sound of thunder almost made me jump off the couch. I looked out the window, seeking some solace in the sight of the wet streets and wind-blown trees. That's when I saw it. My neighbor standing in front of his house, staring straight at my window. His eyes glittered in the stormlight, and his posture, so straight and rigid, looked as if he was waiting for something. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from him. A shudder ran through my body, and a strange feeling of danger invaded my chest. I felt trapped. The man stood there, in the middle of the storm, for what seemed like an eternity. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that something was about to happen. When I finally stepped away from the window and closed the curtains, fear had taken hold of me. Something had changed. Something dark was looming over my neighborhood, and I was at the center of it, caught in a web I didn't know how to avoid. The storm did not stop, and neither did I. I could not stop thinking about that man, about his fixed, penetrating gaze, which seemed to have pierced the very wall of my house. As the hours passed, the restlessness turned into a growing paranoia. I wondered if something was wrong in my head, if I was simply being affected by stress, if my imagination was playing tricks on me. But I knew, deep down, that something wasn't right. Something about his behavior didn't make sense. The next day, the rain persisted, although it was no longer as intense. I decided to go for a walk around the neighborhood as a way to clear my head and calm those disturbing thoughts. As I walked down the sidewalk, I felt someone's gaze on my back. I glanced over my shoulder, but I couldn't see anything. No one was nearby. However, that feeling didn't go away. Something told me that I was being watched, that something was moving in the shadows. It was then that I saw a figure standing in the driveway of my neighbor's house. His posture was as rigid as it had been the night before, so motionless that he looked like a statue in the rain. My heart skipped a beat. I did not understand him. This man, who had seemed so strange to me until then, was now becoming an ominous presence that I could not ignore. The sense of danger was palpable, and I could no longer hide it. I was too focused on what was behind me. Tension gripped my body as the shadows seemed to lengthen and surround me. I felt that someone, or something, was getting closer and closer. It was at that moment that something else happened. The footsteps stopped. The silence became absolute, as if the city itself had suspended its breathing. My mind went on full alert. I turned suddenly, looking out onto the empty street, the lights of the street lamps illuminating a desolate space. Nothing. No one was there. Yet the feeling of being watched was still there, strong and unsettling. I looked everywhere, searching for any sign, any movement, but I saw nothing. My heart was still pounding. I decided to turn around again and continue walking, faster than before, until I felt the need to return home, to return to a place that no longer offered me security, but at least gave me some sense of control. Every step I took, I felt the weight of fear settle more on my shoulders. It wasn't just the rain that was soaking me now, but the sweat of anguish. Someone was stalking me. I didn't know who, but I felt it deeply. When I reached my door, the anxiety was so thick that I could hardly find the key to open it. Once inside, I closed the door behind me with a loud bang, and although the house was safe, something inside me told me that the danger had never left. I could hear my breath hitching, each exhale echoing in my ears. The rain continued outside, relentless, pounding on the windows. But now, it didn't seem comforting. Now, the sound of the falling drops was like a reminder of the chaos I had unleashed. It was a sign that the threat would never go away, that the memories of the incident would continue to haunt me. And worst of all, I knew that somehow, all of this could have been avoided if I hadn't been so trusting, if I hadn't carried on with my life as if nothing had happened. Now, with the certainty that something had broken inside me, I began to understand the true nature of my paranoia. Fear was not only the result of what had happened that night, but a shadow that had settled in my life to stay. I had been a victim of my own trust, of my own naivete, and the lesson was crueler than I could have imagined. But something else had been unleashed inside me. Although I never knew for sure if those men had followed me, or if my mind was playing a cruel joke on me, the fear had left an indelible mark. I could no longer ignore it. I could no longer return to the same life I had before. The roadblocks that once seemed like simple security checkpoints were now places of danger. The streetlights were no longer beacons of guidance, but warnings. And worst of all, I knew that, at some point, my life would be completely transformed by that shadow of distrust that, sooner or later, would consume all that was left of me. We often live our lives guided by a false sense of security, believing that nothing bad will happen until we are suddenly confronted with the fragility of our existence. Trust, that which leads us to trust our surroundings and people, is also our greatest vulnerability. How many of us really pay attention to the warning signs the world gives us? In a world full of shadows and chaos, the line between safety and danger is finer than we think. And sometimes, fear comes not in the form we expect, but in the unsettling stillness that grips our minds when we realize that nothing will ever be the same again. The rain was pounding the window pane furiously. I could hear the drops crashing against the glass with an almost desperate force, as if trying to escape the storm. Outside, everything was plunged into opaque darkness, with the streetlights barely illuminating the shadows crawling along the sodden ground. I was alone in my house, as I always was after work. I didn't like the solitude, but it was all I had left. I remember that day, an ordinary day, or so I thought at first. I had spent the whole day at the office, attending clients, dealing with reports, and thinking about how the daily routine had been eating me up little by little. When I finally got home, the first thing I did was change my clothes, change into something more comfortable, and sit down on the couch with a drink in my hand. I loved the quietness of my home after the daily hustle and bustle, but something had changed. In the neighborhood, it was always peaceful. It was the kind of neighborhood where people greeted each other cordially, where cars didn't speed by, and people knew each other. But that calm crumbled a little over a month ago, when a new neighbor moved in. A middle-aged man with an appearance that seemed to fit the mold of someone normal, but who from the first moment gave me a strange feeling. His eyes, dark and somewhat vacant, always seemed to be watching something beyond the obvious. It wasn't paranoia. There was something about him that didn't add up. At first, his presence was discreet. I hardly saw him, except for the strange noises coming from his house at night. Sometimes it sounded like he was dragging furniture or moving something heavily inside. I didn't pay too much attention to him. We all have our quirks, I thought. But what happened next changed everything. One night, as I was sitting in the living room watching the rain through the window, I heard a knocking on my door. At first I thought it was the wind, but the sound became more persistent, somewhat louder. I got up with a slight feeling of uneasiness and went to open it. When I opened the door, I found the man from the next house. There was no reason for me to be surprised to see him there, but something about his posture made me uncomfortable. He was soaking wet, as if he had been in the rain for hours. He stared at me, saying nothing at first. His expression was expressionless, almost vacant, as if he had no real interest in what I was about to say. "Can you help me with something?" he asked, although it didn't sound like he was really asking for assistance. I watched him in silence, not knowing what to respond. At that moment, there was nothing particularly strange in his request, only the monotonous tone of his voice. However, something in his gaze made me hesitate. "I don't have power in the house," he finally said, as if it didn't matter whether he believed it or not. "I want to know if you could provide me with a cable to link to your home network." It was a strange request. It was unusual for someone to ask for help in that way, but I offered him the cable without hesitation, although a part of me felt that there was something not quite normal in his attitude. His gaze remained fixed on my eyes, as if he was looking for something inside me, something that I could not identify, but that made me even more uncomfortable. As I handed him the cable, I noticed something strange about his hands. They were dirty, but not only because of dirt or dust. They were dark stains, somewhat slimy, as if he had been touching something he shouldn't have. For a moment, I thought maybe he had been working on something in his house, and I didn't look too closely at the details. But as I walked back into my house, a shiver ran down my spine. The rain was pounding harder and harder, and my thoughts were swirling in my mind. As the days went by, something kept hanging around in my head. My neighbor's attitude, the stains on his hands, his cold and distant stare. It all stayed with me, even when I didn't want to think about it. The silence of the neighborhood grew heavier as the weeks passed. Strange noises in her house became more frequent, and sometimes it even seemed like I heard low voices, murmurs, coming from her home. At first I tried to ignore it, thinking that maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks. But the truth is that I couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. Something about that man. Something I didn't want to see or understand. One night, while I was at home, the rain intensified. The storm raged with such force that the sound of thunder almost made me jump off the couch. I looked out the window, seeking some solace in the sight of the wet streets and wind-blown trees. That's when I saw it. My neighbor standing in front of his house, staring straight at my window. His eyes glittered in the stormlight, and his posture, so straight and rigid, looked as if he was waiting for something. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from him. A shudder ran through my body, and a strange feeling of danger invaded my chest. I felt trapped. The man stood there, in the middle of the storm, for what seemed like an eternity. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that something was about to happen. When I finally stepped away from the window and closed the curtains, fear had taken hold of me. Something had changed. Something dark was looming over my neighborhood, and I was at the center of it, caught in a web I didn't know how to avoid. The storm did not stop, and neither did I. I could not stop thinking about that man, about his fixed, penetrating gaze, which seemed to have pierced the very wall of my house. As the hours passed, the restlessness turned into a growing paranoia. I wondered if something was wrong in my head, if I was simply being affected by stress, if my imagination was playing tricks on me. But I knew deep down that something wasn't right. Something about his behavior didn't make sense. The next day, the rain persisted, although it was no longer as intense. I decided to go for a walk around the neighborhood, as a way to clear my head and calm those disturbing thoughts. As I walked down the sidewalk, I felt someone's gaze on my back. I glanced over my shoulder, but I couldn't see anything. No one was nearby. However, that feeling didn't go away. Something told me that I was being watched, that something was moving in the shadows. It was then that I saw a figure standing in the driveway of my neighbor's house. His posture was as rigid as it had been the night before, so motionless that he looked like a statue in the rain. My heart skipped a beat. I did not understand him. This man, who had seemed so strange to me until then, was now becoming an ominous presence that I could not ignore. The sense of danger was palpable, and I could no longer hide it. I quickened my pace and hurried back to my house. The sound of my footsteps hitting the wet pavement combined with the distant thunder, creating an even more oppressive atmosphere. I stepped inside my home, closing the door behind me with more force than I should have. I sensed something lurking, something that was not visible, but was very close. That night, as I tried to rest, a thought came to me. I remembered the strange stains on my neighbor's hands, the shadows lengthening behind his window. I thought of the times I had felt watched, how that feeling had intensified after our brief interaction. Something was happening, something I couldn't understand, but which terrified me deeply. There was something about him, something hidden, something that didn't fit his appearance as a normal man. The next few days passed in a heartbeat, but my paranoia did not diminish. Every time I passed near his house, I felt as if the air was thicker, as if someone was watching my movements. Even during the night, when I lay in bed, I could feel his gaze through the walls, as if he was waiting for the right moment to make his next move. The breaking point came one afternoon. I returned home after a long day at work, exhausted and with my head full of worries. As I turned the key to open the door, something made me stop. On the floor in front of the entrance was an envelope. It wasn't there when I left in the morning. The envelope was damp from the rain, the corners frayed from the water, but in the center, one word was written in black, shaky letters: next. A shiver ran down my spine. I bent down to pick it up, my hands shaking. Opening it, I found a photo. In it, I was standing in my garden, looking out my own window, unaware that someone was watching me. The photo was taken from inside my neighbor's house through one of the slits in his curtain. I could not believe it. I was being watched, and in a meticulous way. Someone was inside my life, watching my most intimate movements, but the scariest thing was that I didn't even know who or why. I entered the house and closed the door behind me quickly. My mind was full of disturbing images, dark thoughts, but the worst was the feeling of being trapped. I couldn't get out. I couldn't stay still. Every time I looked around, I felt that the walls of my home were closing in on me, that there was no safe place, that my own refuge had become a prison. Days passed and the tension grew. There was something sinister in my neighbor's behavior, something that rose beyond mere strangeness. Every time I saw him, that feeling of being watched increased, but I could not give shape to my fears. In the evenings, when all was quiet, I felt the presence of someone near my window. It was no longer paranoia. It was the certainty that someone, with a terrifying calmness, was waiting for the perfect moment to take the next step. I couldn't stay at home any longer. There was a part of me that knew my safety was no longer guaranteed. I decided to do the only thing I could do at that moment: leave the neighborhood. My mind struggled with the idea, but my survival instinct had awakened in such a way that I could no longer ignore it. I packed my things in a hurry, and as I closed the boxes, fear gripped me more than ever. Every step I took in the moving process seemed to take me further away from the calm I had lost, and every sigh mingled with the rain that would not let up. The days that followed brought me no solace. Had I made the right decision? Had I escaped in time? Or perhaps the real threat was not the man who stalked me, but the terror that had been born within me, one that would continue to haunt me, no matter where I went. Finally, I took the car and drove away. As I lost my way through the rain-soaked streets, one last glance at the neighborhood made me wonder something. Had I escaped from my neighbor? Or had I escaped from something much deeper, something inside me that I could now never forget? Fear, sometimes, is not in what we see, but in what we fear is waiting to be discovered. I can see that the simplest situations can become uncontrollable sources of anxiety and fear. When it is a human being that begins to threaten our emotional stability, our perception of reality quickly becomes distorted. It is easy to think that the real terror lies in the unknown, but the most terrifying thing often lies in what we already know, in what we are able to create in our own minds. In the end, how safe are we really, even within our own homes? The rain never stopped that night. It pounded hard on the window panes, and the sound was so constant that it seemed to have invaded my mind. I couldn't think clearly. The cell phone in my hands vibrated once again, breaking the tense silence that had settled in the house. The message was still there, like a weight in the air, impossible to ignore. He deserved it. That was all the letters said, but those words were enough to trigger a series of questions that no one wanted to answer. My father had disappeared 2 days earlier. There was no trace, no indication of what might have happened to him. The police had searched every corner, every street, every nook and cranny of the neighborhood, but nothing. 2 days with no news until that message arrived. I didn't even know who had sent it. It was only clear to me that something terrible was happening, something much darker than I had ever imagined. At first, my father's disappearance seemed like a simple coincidence. He had gone through some work difficulties in recent months, but nothing to suggest that his life might be in danger. The last thing I remembered about him before his disappearance was his tired face, the worry in his eyes. I never imagined that would be the prelude to something much bigger. The hours passed slowly. Each passing second seemed to intensify the tension I felt. My mother was completely destroyed. I called every contact I had but got no answer. Nothing. For my part, I decided not to sit idly by. I had to do something. I couldn't just wait for the situation to resolve itself. I left the house, my black coat soaking wet from the rain, my shoes sinking in the mud. I walked through the deserted streets, my mind clouded by anguish, but something inside me was pushing me to search, to find some clue that would give me answers. Each step was heavier than the last. At first, I thought the rain was the only thing hindering my vision, but then I realized it was something else. A sense of discomfort, of being watched. I was not alone. Every street I walked down, every dark corner I crossed, seemed to have something lurking in the shadows. I tried to ignore that feeling, but I couldn't. My mind was playing tricks on me. My mind was playing tricks on me. Who would be watching me? I couldn't stop to think about that now. My search began in the places we used to frequent together, my father and I. The small shops, the stores where he bought his cigarettes, the bar where he used to meet his old friends. The small stores, the stores where he used to buy his cigarettes, the bar where he used to meet his old friends. Nothing seemed to indicate that he had been there. However, the more I investigated, the more I realized how absurd my approach was. My father was not a person who disappeared without a trace. He had been a quiet man, an exemplary father, or so I had believed until now. But as the hours passed, something was revealing itself. The rain was relentless, but the air became thicker, as if it was hiding something, as if everything around me was trying to prevent me from getting to the truth. I went to his workplace, a small architectural office where he had worked for years. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but upon closer inspection, I began to notice strange details. The messy papers, the open folders, the ink stains on the desk, the disconnected computer cables. Something didn't fit, and that's when I found the first clue, an envelope with no return address, with the word urgent written in shaky letters. My heart skipped a beat when I opened it. Inside, I found a couple of photos. The first showed my father in a meeting with people I didn't know. They appeared to be businessmen, but their faces were distorted, blurred, as if someone had manipulated the images to hide their identities. The second photo was more disturbing. My father was standing in what appeared to be a dark alley, alone, looking at something out of view of the camera. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Why was my father, who had always been so reserved, so self-assured, involved in something so dark? What was going on? Anxiety enveloped me, but I couldn't give up. I had to keep looking. I knew my father was in the middle of something dangerous. My head was spinning with dark thoughts, but what worried me most was that I didn't know if I was about to enter a world I didn't even understand, a world full of secrets that could destroy us all. As I progressed in the search, each clue I found seemed only to complicate things further. I met people I had never seen before, shadowy figures who didn't want to tell me anything. Yet there was something in their eyes that made me feel even more out of place, as if they knew something I didn't, as if everything I was doing was futile. My father had somehow been involved with them, but in what way? I could not trust anyone. I felt that my life, my family's life, was in danger. I was caught up in something bigger than me, something I could not control, but which had unknowingly pulled me into its abyss. The rain began to fall harder, the drops crashing to the pavement like tiny crystals. Something in the air told me that I was close, that the answer was just around the corner. But every time I tried to get closer to the truth, everything fell apart even more. The feeling of being watched, of being part of something much bigger and more dangerous, made me fear the worst. The search continued. My mind, my heart, everything seemed to be in a constant state of alert. I didn't know how much more I could take. But what I did know was that I had to keep going, for my father, for my family, for my own life. If what was happening was what I thought it was, then there was no turning back. We were trapped in a game we couldn't escape. The story of my father's disappearance was not just a matter of finding answers. It was a reminder that the lives closest to us may be hiding dark secrets we would never imagine. And like me, we can be drawn unknowingly into a world of violence, manipulation, and betrayal, one that we never asked to be a part of, but which, when we become involved, makes us question our own safety and choices. Sometimes, what we think we know and understand about the people closest to us is actually much further away than we imagine. The rain was no longer just a nuisance. It was a constant presence, as if the sky was crying beside me, covering the pain of a truth I did not want to accept. I was standing in the middle of a dark street, looking at the diffuse reflection of the city lights on the puddle of water forming at my feet. My thoughts were confused, a mixture of anger, fear, and despair. I had reached a point where I no longer knew if it was my father I was looking for, or the truth behind his disappearance. As I went on, the memories of what my life with him had been like faded, erased by the feeling that everything I knew was about to collapse. I decided to go back to the last concrete clue I had found, the dark alley. I remembered the picture I had seen, where my father was there, seemingly alone, looking towards something I could not see. There was something in the picture that I couldn't ignore, a feeling that that place, that alley, held the key to everything. Something told me that there was the answer. And that same intuition led me back to that place. The street was deserted. The silence was absolute, and the sound of my footsteps on the water was the only thing that broke the stillness. Suddenly, a cold breeze made me shiver. I looked around, searching for some sign, some clue that my father had been there, that it was not all an illusion. And then I saw him, a shadow on the corner of the alley, hidden under the dim light of a street lamp. My heart skipped a beat. The same instinct that had led me to this place was now pushing me closer. I was aware that I was about to discover something significant. As I got closer, the smell of dampness and wet earth became denser, almost suffocating. And then, a voice came to my mind. "Don't come closer." It was a whisper, as soft as the wind, but I felt it deep inside me. Was it my own fear, or was someone warning me? I didn't know, but it didn't matter anymore. I couldn't turn away. Not after everything I had discovered. The figure in the corner of the alley stood still, as if waiting for me to arrive. Cold sweat ran down my back, but my feet kept moving forward, as if something else was controlling my movements. Finally, I was close enough to see clearly what had been hidden in the shadows. It was a man, about 40 years old, with a gaze so cold and calculating that it made me feel as if he had been watching me from the moment I arrived in the neighborhood. He was not alone. Next to him was a black backpack, something I hadn't noticed before. The man said nothing, but something in his posture, in the way he stood motionless, let me know that this was not going to be a friendly conversation. Without thinking, I took a step back, seeking to get out of his reach. But when I did, I felt a pressure in the air, as if everything around me was taking on a life of its own. The man slowly raised his hand, and before I could react, the backpack opened on its own, revealing a series of photos, the same photos I had found in my father's office. My heart pounded in my chest. The photos were in the same style, but these featured people I didn't know, some with their gaze fixed on the camera, others with their eyes unfocused, almost as if they were under some kind of trance. Everything was connected, but I still didn't understand how. However, something else caught my attention. In the corner of one of the photos, there was a handwritten date. 2 months ago. My mind began to go faster than my body, processing information at a dangerous speed. Was my father involved with these people? What was this dark bond that had drawn him into something so macabre? The man watched me, and then something strange happened. A sound, a rustling underwater, as if someone was walking behind me. My blood froze. I knew I wasn't alone in that alley, but when I turned around to look, the darkness answered me with emptiness. The man in the corner simply watched, as if none of it surprised him. I felt trapped, surrounded, with no clear way out. The images of my father, the people around him, the pictures I found, everything seemed to be coming together in a frightening way. My father was not who I thought he was. He was not the quiet man I had always known. He had been playing a much more dangerous game, a game that had no way back. The pressure in the air was increasing. Something was moving behind me, but I couldn't afford to turn around. Something told me that if I did, everything would fall apart. I gritted my teeth, breathing hard, and began to walk toward the man in the corner, knowing that I had to face him, that only by doing so could I find out what I needed to know. Each step I took toward him was heavier than the last, but I couldn't give up now. The man didn't move, but as I approached, I could see the slight smile on his face. It was as if he was waiting for my reaction. When I was close enough, he raised his hand, pointing to something behind me. I didn't look at him, but his gesture was enough to confirm what I already knew. I was trapped, and the truth I was looking for, the answer I needed, would cost me much more than I had imagined. Sometimes the search for answers can be more dangerous than ignorance. What you think you know about the people closest to you, what you think you understand about their lives, may be just a facade, a veil that hides a much darker, much more disturbing world. The people we interact with every day, those who seem harmless, may be involved in situations so dangerous that we would never imagine. The truth is not always something that frees us. Sometimes, it is something that consumes us. My father was not the man I thought he was. My search for answers not only endangered my life, but also revealed that the world I knew was full of secrets and lies. And in the end, the worst truth is not the one we find, but the one that drags us into an abyss from which we cannot escape. You never know who you're really dealing with. No matter what you think you know, there is always something else out there, something that can change everything you thought you knew. The rain beats down on the roof of my apartment furiously, as if the sky is angry with me. The sound of the water crashing against the windows is almost as deafening as the thoughts running through my head. I never thought it would end up like this. Not when I downloaded the app, not when I started talking to her, not when our first conversation seemed like the closest thing to perfection. But here I am, alone, in the middle of a storm, with the feeling that something has gone horribly wrong. From the moment I met her on that dating app, I felt an immediate connection. She wasn't like the other people I had talked to, always superficial, always with a standard message. She was different, or so I thought at first. We would send each other long, detailed messages, almost as if she was looking for more than just a swipe on the screen. Every night I found it hard to stop talking to her. She would keep me up until the wee hours of the morning sharing stories, thoughts, and dreams. It was as if something brought us together, as if we were two pieces that fit perfectly. When I finally agreed to meet in person, I was surprised at how easy it was. We were so connected, I thought, that there would be nothing that could disrupt that harmony. We decided to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. As the day approached, something inside me began to make me uneasy. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a strange sense of anticipation came over me. The cafe was cozy, with an antique decor that looked like something out of another time. I sat at a table in the back as we had agreed. I looked at my watch. It was almost time for her to arrive. 1 minute, 2, 5. I couldn't help but check my phone constantly, waiting for some notification, some sign of her arrival. But there was nothing, just the heavy silence of a wait that started to become unbearable. After 10 minutes, my patience ran out, and I sent him a message. The reply never came. And then, for no apparent reason, the app stopped working. I tried to restart the phone, but something strange happened. The screen froze, and then the phone shut down completely. At that moment, I felt a tightness in my chest. The rain, which had started as a light drizzle, was now hitting the glass with a force that made me feel more isolated than I already was. I decided to return home. As I walked through the empty streets, the sky seemed to have fallen into a complete collapse. Water was falling as if the world was breaking apart. On the way, I began to wonder if I had made a mistake in trusting her, if I had been so blinded by my desires that I had failed to consider the obvious. Something wasn't right. But it wasn't until I reached my apartment that the real unease took hold of me. The air was heavy, and the light from the lamp in the hallway flickered slightly, as if it was going to go out. I didn't think too much about it, until I noticed something even stranger. My door was ajar. I was sure I had closed it on my way out. A shiver ran down my spine, and my steps slowed. Inside, the darkness was thick, but the rain was still echoing, a distant echo that seemed to come from everywhere. I walked over to the dining room table where my phone rested. It was on, but the screen showed something I hadn't seen before. A message. It wasn't from her. The application interface was no longer the same. It was distorted, as if someone had tampered with the code behind the app, as if someone was using my account without my permission. My heart began to pound. No one else had access to my phone. No one else except her. My mind began to spin in circles, and then I realized that something was not making sense. The app had not only stopped working at the time, it was now present in my life in an overly invasive way. In desperation, I decided to delete it from my phone, but the app was still open. The screen flickered and went completely black, as if it was streaming something in real time. Suddenly, an image appeared. It wasn't a photo, it wasn't a message. It was a sequence, a video. In the video, I appeared, and behind me, in the dimness of the room, something else was moving. I tried to close the application, but I could not. The screen showed my face, but the image reflected in the background I didn't recognize. It wasn't the room I was in. It wasn't the city. It wasn't anything I knew. It was an empty, messy place, with broken furniture and paper on the floor. Something was there. Something was moving, but it wasn't her. It was another figure, a shadow approaching with an eerie calm. My pulse quickened, and without thinking, I turned off the phone, tossing it on the table. The sound of the storm outside intensified, as if it wanted to drown out my thoughts, but the anxiety was still there, probing the darkness. Something was happening, and I couldn't stop it. The next few hours passed in a confused sea of thoughts, as if my mind was trying to make sense of what I had seen on the phone. But the sense of dread that had begun with the strange message only intensified. The rain was still falling. Its rhythmic pounding on the roof and windows had become an incessant, almost unbearable sound. Each drop seemed to mark the pace of my anxiety. Sitting at the dining room table, my fingers trembled as I tried to hold the phone. I had turned the screen off several times, but somehow, every time I turned it on, the same cluttered interface brought back that feeling of invasion. The message persisted, like a ghost trapped in the guts of the device. It's too late to go back. You are no longer who you were. The words replayed in my head over and over, their meaning expanding with each repetition. The feeling of discomfort had given way to pure fear. I felt a pressure in my chest, as if something invisible was crushing me from the inside. I wanted to scream, but something inside me told me that it didn't matter what I did. There was no escape. The phone was still on, and the now empty screen reflected my face. Something had changed in the image. The glow of the ceiling lamp was flickering, and in the dark reflection of the window glass, I could make out a moving shadow. But when I turned to the window, there was nothing, just darkness and rain. I got up and walked to the window. I looked out at the empty street, drenched by the storm. The street lights flickered, as if they had a life of their own, flickering at irregular intervals. The sound of falling water had become a continuous murmur, and for an instant I felt disconnected from everything around me. But something, an incomprehensible intuition, told me that I should not stay there. The silence in the apartment was oppressive, but it also seemed to be filled with invisible presences, as if something was waiting for me to make a mistake. With an urgency I didn't understand, I headed for the door. Maybe I needed fresh air. Maybe I just wanted to escape the lump in my throat. I stepped outside without a second thought, leaving the humid heat of the apartment behind, and found the rain pouring down, drenching me in seconds. The empty streets seemed more desolate than I remembered them. Every step I took echoed in the stillness of the city, as if the world had been plunged into a sepulchral silence, broken only by the roar of the wind and the pattering of the drops against the asphalt. As I walked through the streets, my mind began to wander, and it was then that I realized that I was not thinking clearly. The image of the telephone, the shadow reflected in the glass, the feeling of being watched. All this was taking hold of me, but at the same time I could not understand if what I had experienced was real, or if my mind was playing a cruel joke on me. It was then that I saw her, or rather, I thought I saw her. In the distance, about 100 meters in front of me, a figure was walking in the rain. A female silhouette, walking slowly along the sidewalk. The umbrella that the woman was carrying, although it seemed that she had tried, could not protect her from the water. I watched her, paralyzed. Something about her walk seemed strangely familiar, as if I had seen her before, but I couldn't place her. A shiver ran down my spine. My breathing became more erratic. My instinct told me that I should run away, that this figure was not what she seemed. The rain was intensifying. The figure advanced, and each time she came closer, the feeling of recognition in my chest grew stronger. It wasn't her. It couldn't be. But then I realized something disturbing. The woman didn't seem to notice my presence. She wasn't looking at me. She seemed to walk in a direction that made no sense, her eyes never resting on me. I stopped in my tracks. A knot formed in my stomach. The figure was very close now, only a few steps between us, and his pace was still as slow as at first. My mind, flooded with fear, could not process what was happening. As the woman drew closer, the atmosphere became denser, as if the air was thickening. The sound of the rain no longer seemed enough to cover the heavy silence that surrounded us. When the figure was right in front of me, I quickly stepped back, realizing to my horror that the woman didn't even seem to notice me. I looked at her more closely, and it was at that moment that something indescribable froze me in place. Her eyes were empty. They were not human eyes. They were hollow, dark, as if all light had been absorbed by them. My mind could not accept what I was seeing. It was not a person. It was not her. But simultaneously something told me it was. The figure passed by without uttering a single sound, its lifeless mechanical walk the only thing it left behind. Finally, I managed to move. I took a step back and then another, but when I looked back to where the figure had been, there was nothing there. The street was empty, just as before, but the feeling that something was wrong still crept into every corner of my being. My thoughts were tumbling, colliding with each other, and my breathing was getting faster and faster. I didn't want to stay there. I didn't want to stay in the city a minute longer. I returned to my apartment, but anxiety would not leave me alone. Inside, the storm roared like a wild animal, and the lamplight flickered again, in a more frantic way, as if it was about to go out completely. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, about the figure, about the empty eyes. Something told me that it hadn't been a mistake, that it hadn't been a simple mirage. There was something deeply disturbing about it all. The phone, abandoned on the table, was still on. I approached it slowly, almost afraid of what I would find on the screen. But I didn't need to look, because when I touched the device, the same distorted interface appeared before me, and with it, the image of the video. The face in the reflection was still mine, but the background had changed. It was no longer my apartment. It was a different place, one I couldn't identify. It was dark, cluttered. Broken furniture and trash scattered on the floor were the only visible decoration. My heart began to beat faster. Something moved in the distance. A shadow, perhaps a person, was slowly approaching the camera, as if it knew I was watching. I couldn't move, couldn't react. The video kept running, showing me the figure getting closer and closer. And then I knew. I had been watched, not just in that instant, but in every instant. My life had been invaded, not just by an app, but by something much darker and more subtle. I had connected with something, with someone, but not in the way I thought. I had looked for something on that screen, and now there was no turning back. Suddenly the phone went dead, and with it, everything plunged into an abyss of darkness. The rain continued to fall outside, and I no longer knew if what I had experienced had been real or a product of my broken mind. But in that instant, I realized something deeply disturbing. The real invasion had not been the phone, nor the video, nor the shadows. It had been the connection itself, one I had created without realizing it, a connection that had never been what I imagined. And in the end, that was the most terrifying lesson of all. Human beings can connect in ways far darker and more dangerous than they realize. I stood there, petrified, not knowing what to do. The feeling of being trapped in something I didn't understand was unbearable, as if time and space were stretched to breaking. Finally, I managed to move. I took a step back, and then another, but when I looked back to where the figure had been, there was nothing there. The street was empty, just as before, but the feeling that something was wrong still crept into every corner of my being. My thoughts were tumbling, colliding with each other, and my breathing was getting faster and faster. I didn't want to stay there. I didn't want to stay in the city a minute longer. I returned to my apartment, but anxiety would not leave me alone. Inside, the storm roared like a wild animal, and the lamplight flickered again, in a more frantic way, as if it was about to go out completely. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, about the figure, about the empty eyes. Something told me that it hadn't been a mistake, that it hadn't been a simple mirage. There was something deeply disturbing about it all. The phone, abandoned on the table, was still on. I approached it slowly, almost afraid of what I would find on the screen. But I didn't need to look, because when I touched the device, the same distorted interface appeared before me, and with it, the image of the video. The face in the reflection was still mine, but the background had changed. It was no longer my apartment. It was a different place, one I couldn't identify. It was dark, cluttered. Broken furniture and trash scattered on the floor were the only visible decoration. My heart began to beat faster. Something moved in the distance. A shadow, perhaps a person, was slowly approaching the camera, as if it knew I was watching. I couldn't move, couldn't react. The video kept running, showing me the figure getting closer and closer. And then I knew. I had been watched, not just in that instant, but in every instant. My life had been invaded, not just by an app, but by something much darker and more subtle. I had connected with something, with someone, but not in the way I thought. I had looked for something on that screen, and now there was no turning back. Suddenly, the phone went dead, and with it, everything plunged into an abyss of darkness. The rain continued to fall outside, and I no longer knew if what I had experienced had been real or a product of my broken mind. But in that instant, I realized something deeply disturbing. The real invasion had not been the phone, nor the video, nor the shadows. It had been the connection itself, one I had created without realizing it, a connection that had never been what I imagined. And in the end, that was the most terrifying lesson of all. Human beings can connect in ways far darker and more dangerous than they realize. I don't know if it was the rain that made everything even more unbearable, or if it was the simple fact of having made a decision that, in the end, dragged us to the brink of madness. But that afternoon began like any other. My wife and I were in the living room, watching TV, when we decided it was time to replace the old washing machine. The machine was already showing signs that its useful life had come to an end, and we didn't want to keep hearing that metallic noise every time we turned it on. Something as trivial as that, a simple purchase, ended up crumbling our peace of mind. We searched online and hired a technician through a service app. The site had good reviews, and since we were in a hurry, it seemed like the most practical thing to do. It was a small, insignificant decision that turned out to be the beginning of a nightmare. When he arrived, the guy seemed harmless. In fact, he introduced himself with a friendly smile and was very professional from the start. His name was Hugo. He was soft-spoken, somewhat raspy from the fatigue of his day, but his eyes were what really captured the attention. They weren't particularly disturbing, but there was something about them that made me uncomfortable. I can't describe it precisely. Something in his gaze seemed to follow me, as if he was watching me more than necessary. My wife and I didn't pay much attention to him. After all, he was just a technician. He showed us how he would install the new washer, started taking apart the old one, and seemed to be competent at his job. However, something strange happened while he was working in the basement. I was downstairs, installing the new machine, and I heard a couple of strange noises coming from the tool room. I didn't think much of it at first, as I had the feeling that Hugo was moving around the house as if he was part of the environment. But then the rain started pounding harder on the roof, and the water noises mixed with the sound of the tools. When the installation was finished, he gave me a couple of quick instructions on how to operate the new washer. He walked out the door with the same smile, and that was it. I didn't think I'd ever see him again, but I was wrong. The first message arrived the next day. It was a text message on my phone, but I didn't recognize the number. Hope the installation went well. Glad to have met you. That was it. Just that. Harmless stuff, right? My wife didn't think it was a bad thing. She said it was probably a professional courtesy, but something in me couldn't help but feel there was something off about it. I didn't respond, at least not right away, but the messages kept coming. In fact, they came more and more frequently. At first, Hugo seemed fine, sending little reminders about how to use the washing machine or trivial details about appliances. I didn't answer, but I felt uncomfortable every time I looked at the phone. The pressure was building without anyone else in the house noticing. My wife thought it was a passing discomfort, but I was beginning to feel something creeping in the shadows, waiting to catch us. A week later, Hugo showed up at our door, without warning. He was there, smiling again, as if there was no cause for alarm. "I noticed the washing machine isn't working as it should," he said, almost as if not a single day had passed since his last visit. Before I could say anything, He was already inside, without waiting for an invitation. My wife was in the living room, and when she saw him, her face went from surprise to discomfort. Hugo, undeterred, began to speak to her matter-of-factly, as if he were an old friend. But I noticed how his eyes averted every time she moved. Something was changing. My wife, polite and trying to be nice, offered him water, but his attitude was cold, distant. Hugo seemed to pick up on this aloofness and began to try to converse more with her. I was trying to intervene, asking her about the washing machine, but Hugo diverted the conversation into very personal territory, talking about my wife, about me, and about things I shouldn't know. The fact that he knew details about our daily life, little things like the name of our dog or the decor of our living room, began to disturb me deeply. I felt watched, but I couldn't prove it. I couldn't tell my wife that something was wrong, since she didn't see what I saw, or what I felt. The worst was the last time I saw him walk through that door. At first, I thought he was overreacting, but the messages were getting darker and darker. Hugo started sending handwritten notes in which he spoke directly to me, as if we had known each other forever. In one of them, he said, "I know you're scared about what's happening, but don't worry. I'm doing it because I want you to be calm. Everything will be okay, I promise." That was the last straw. My wife, who had begun to notice my paranoia, began to panic as well. That's when I decided to talk to the authorities. But they didn't believe me. Not at first. They said it was mild harassment, that there was no evidence, that Hugo seemed just an annoying man, but not a real danger. They didn't see the notes. They didn't see the messages. And worst of all, they didn't understand what I was feeling, what was going on in my mind. I felt that Hugo was waiting for something, that he was lurking, planning something I couldn't anticipate. We moved. Everything happened quietly, without anyone knowing. I kept thinking that Hugo might show up at any moment. Despite the move, something inside me knew it wasn't over. Hugo knew how to find us. He knew more than he should. The night I received the letter, everything I had been repressing came to the surface. My hands trembled as I picked it up from the floor, as if the paper was on fire. The words written on it seemed to float, defying the gravity of my mind. I've already found them. They are mine. That sentence, so direct, so dry, pulled me into a spiral of increasingly dark thoughts. My wife was in the living room, oblivious to what I had found. I could not tell her, could not share the weight of this fear. She had begun to relax, to think that everything that had happened in the previous house had been just a passing nightmare, a mistake. But I knew it wasn't. Hugo was not someone who would leave you alone over time. Hugo was a man who would drill into your mind, make you think the danger was over, when in reality he was just waiting for the perfect moment to act. For weeks we tried to get on with our lives. We began to think that maybe things would get better. The new house was bigger, more isolated. We thought that by moving we were doing the right thing. We changed the phone numbers, blocked any trace of personal information that might have been left behind. We changed even our daily routine, hoping that by doing so, we would be free from the burden of threats. But all that only fed a truth that terrified me more and more. Hugo was close, always close. The rain was constant. One afternoon, after a stormy day, I stood in front of the living room window, watching the drops slide down the glass, while my wife prepared dinner in the kitchen. Something didn't feel right. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as if everything around was suspended, waiting for something. My gaze strayed to the front door. There was no one there, but I felt watched. I knew right then, something was happening. Paranoia had completely taken hold of me. I felt like memories of our old house were haunting me, and Hugo, with his invisible but palpable presence, was toying with our sanity. There was something in his messages, something in his letters, that told me we were no longer masters of our own lives. He was in control. He had our minds. That night, as the storm pounded the window furiously, the door to the foyer slowly opened. It wasn't a sound that woke me. There was no knock or knock. The door simply opened, as if someone had done it without my noticing. I didn't think it was possible, but there it was. The door open, with the key in place. My heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be. No one else knew the combination to the lock. No one. My breathing became more erratic. I wasn't prepared to face what I knew was going to happen. What I feared more than anything was that Hugo had found our new home. He had breached our defenses, and I had been blind to it. My wife did not understand the terror that consumed me. At first, she tried to reassure me, suggesting that maybe it was the wind or some fault in the security system. But I knew better. Hugo had been here. He had walked through our door, had penetrated our life again, and we were not going to escape. It didn't matter how many times we moved, how many phones we changed, how many locks we put on. Over the next few weeks, the situation worsened. The messages became more direct. Sometimes I found myself staring at my phone, not wanting to, but unable to help myself. The screen would call out to me, and there was Hugo, typing in a tone so familiar it terrified me. "I see you," he'd say in one of the messages. "I know what you do." One afternoon, I came home early from work. The rain was coming down hard, pounding the ground and creating a deafening roar. When I entered the house once again, I found the door open, and this time, the living room light was flickering strangely, as if someone had tampered with it. My first impulse was to call my wife, but I stopped halfway. Something was not right. A knot formed in my stomach, and I felt my legs turn to jelly. My wife was neither in the kitchen nor in the living room. I hurried toward the stairs, but something made me stop. Someone had written in red ink on the bathroom mirror in crude, messy words. "I've already found them. They're mine." That sentence, which I now saw in every corner, was slowly killing me. Hugo had been here, not just in our hose, but inside our minds. We could no longer run away. I received another message, this time with a photo. My heart stopped when I saw it. It was a picture of our house, taken from the end of the street, on the corner, where the shadow of a man stood out under the light of a street lamp. Hugo not only knew where we lived, now he knew what we did, what time we went out, what we ate. Everything. Desperate, I decided to take action. I plucked up my courage and looked for the police telephone number. When I managed to speak to an officer, all I was told was that I had to provide more evidence. The problem was that, although I had messages and letters, there was no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no witnesses. My paranoia, my fears, my suspicions, it all seemed insignificant to them. In the end, they ended up hanging up, telling me to take care of my safety. Impotence consumed me completely. What else could I do? How could I protect my wife if the police didn't believe me? How could I run away if, every time I closed my eyes, I saw Hugo's eyes watching us? Later that evening, as I sat on the couch, staring at the closed door and the phone vibrating over and over with new messages, I heard a knock on the dining room window. The rain had stopped, but the tension in the air was about to explode. I stood up, my heart pounding, and approached the window, cautious, my soul on edge. On the glass, as if it were a mark of the storm itself, there appeared something written. "I have them. They will never go away." Panic overtook me, and the only clear feeling I had was that no matter how many times we moved, how many times we changed our lives, Hugo was already in us. He had found a way to penetrate the deepest security, not in the house, but in our minds. He had invaded us in such a way that neither the change of scenery, nor the bars, nor the keys, nor the security cameras could stop him. Hugo's last message came while he was trying to sleep. "I can wait. I will see you soon." I understood immediately. The real terror was not that he found us physically. It was that he had us trapped in his game, in his psychological control. We could no longer escape from him. This man, whom we did not even know well, had done something much more sinister. He had invaded our psyche. He had achieved something more powerful than simple harassment. He had marked us like a prey that already knows that, sooner or later, its hunter will find it. In this game, it wasn't the locks or the doors that kept us safe. It was the mind, and Hugo knew that better than anyone. The scariest lesson I learned was that the real threat is not always physical. People can become more dangerous when they understand how to break your resistance from the inside, when they manage to infiltrate your thoughts, your emotions, your deepest fears. And Hugo had done it. I have never been one to believe in signs, omens, or those bad vibes stories. I've been working in a cargo transport for years with my partner Raul. I know every pothole, every curve, every stop on that route. The rainstorms are almost a constant, and in general, lonely nights on the road don't bother me anymore. But that night, that damn night, was not like any other. It was a Tuesday. Or so I thought. Time is diluted when you are behind the wheel for so many hours, accompanied only by the constant noise of the engine, the rain hitting the windshield, and the glare of the headlights cutting through the blackness of the night. The road was silent, only the murmur of the engine and the swaying of the truck to mark the passing of time. I drove while Raul, next to me, was in a kind of sleep, half awake, half lost. The truck was big, sturdy, with a load of high-value electronic equipment. I knew the job was not easy, but I never imagined that something as common as this journey would turn into a nightmare. In the distance, on a wide curve, I saw what I didn't like from the first second. A pickup truck parked at the edge of the road, no lights on, no license plates visible, almost merged with the darkness of the storm. It was too still, too out of place. True, most vehicles stopped for bad weather, for traffic, for some mishap on the road, but that van had no excuse for being there. I mentioned it quietly, but Raul paid no attention. It made me feel silly for thinking it might be something else. Sometimes you get paranoid from exhaustion, from isolation. After all, the world doesn't stop for a storm. However, the feeling in my stomach did not leave me. That van, invisible and silent, was stalking me. As we kept going, the road began to get narrower, the rains came down harder, and visibility was reduced. And just when I thought my mind was playing tricks, I felt it in the air. Something was about to happen. It was like an instinct. I knew we were not alone on the road. Then, as if fate had made a signal, the van turned on its taillights and began to move. It was not a sudden start, but something calculated, almost imperceptible. The vehicle began to follow us closely, keeping a dangerous distance. My eyes widened, adrenaline surged immediately. Raul, still sleepy, asked me if something was wrong. I told him no, but the uneasiness was palpable in my nerves. For a few kilometers, I tried to stay calm, making sure we were not being chased. But we weren't. Every time I accelerated, the van did the same. Every time I tried to slow down to analyze the situation, so did she. It was a game, one of patience, one in which I knew something was about to happen. My hands were starting to sweat. Fear was taking over me. I felt the first blow when the truck rammed us from the side. It was a dry, heavy impact that made me lose control for a second. The truck began to slide down the wet road, and the light from the truck's headlights almost blinded me as it continued to press on. Raul screamed, but I was too focused on not rolling over. I accelerated hard, giving my best to the engine, but the van followed in our wake, unstoppable. I tried to maneuver to lose her in a curve, but there was no time. The noise of the impact was louder in the next collision, and the weight of the van pushed us to the side of the road. My heart was beating a mile a minute. Sweat covered my forehead and my mind was clouding. We had no plan. There was no way out. The only thing I knew was that that van wasn't going to stop until it had us. The impact had left us reeling, but the truck was still standing, and that was all that mattered at that moment. However, the feeling of being stalked, watched, did not go away. The truck, which had originally been just a few feet behind us, was no longer in sight. It was a second of respite, of false calm. For a few moments, Raoul and I looked at each other in silence. He was pale, frightened, and I felt that fear had marked me, that I could not rest until I understood what the hell was going on. I received another message, this time with a photo. My heart stopped when I saw it. It was a picture of our house, taken from the end of the street, on the corner, where the shadow of a man stood out under the light of a street lamp. Hugo not only knew where we lived, now he knew what we did, what time we went out, what we ate, everything. Desperate, I decided to take action. I plucked up my courage and looked for the police telephone number. When I managed to speak to an officer, all I was told was that I had to provide more evidence. The problem was that, although I had messages and letters, there was no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no witnesses. My paranoia, my fears, my suspicions, it all seemed insignificant to them. In the end, they ended up hanging up, telling me to take care of my safety. Impotence consumed me completely. What else could I do? How could I protect my wife if the police didn't believe me? How could I run away if every time I closed my eyes, I saw Hugo's eyes watching us? Later that evening, as I sat on the couch, staring at the closed door and the phone vibrating over and over with new messages, I heard a knock on the dining room window. The rain had stopped, but the tension in the air was about to explode. I stood up, my heart pounding, and approached the window, cautious, my soul on edge. On the glass, as if it were a mark of the storm itself, there appeared something written. I have them. They will never go away. Panic overtook me, and the only clear feeling I had was that no matter how many times we moved, how many times we changed our lives, Hugo was already in us. He had found a way to penetrate the deepest security, not in the house, but in our minds. He had invaded us in such a way that neither the change of scenery, nor the bars, nor the keys, nor the security cameras could stop him. Hugo's last message came while he was trying to sleep. I can wait. I will see you soon. I understood immediately. The real terror was not that he found us physically. It was that he had us trapped in his game, in his psychological control. We could no longer escape from him. This man, whom we did not even know well, had done something much more sinister. He had invaded our psyche. He had achieved something more powerful than simple harassment. He had marked us, like a prey that already knows that sooner or later, its hunter will find it. In this game, it wasn't the locks or the doors that kept us safe. It was the mind. And Hugo knew that better than anyone. The scariest lesson I learned was that the real threat is not always physical. People can become more dangerous when they understand how to break your resistance from the inside, when they manage to infiltrate your thoughts, your emotions, your deepest fears. And Hugo had done it. I have never been one to believe in signs, omens, or those bad vibes stories. I have been working in a cargo transport for years with my partner Raoul. I know every pothole, every curve, every stop on that route. The rainstorms are almost a constant, and in general, lonely nights on the road don't bother me anymore. But that night, that damn night, was not like any other. It was a Tuesday, or so I thought. Time is diluted when you are behind the wheel for so many hours, accompanied only by the constant noise of the engine, the rain hitting the windshield, and the glare of the headlights cutting through the blackness of the night. The road was silent, only the murmur of the engine and the swaying of the truck to mark the passing of time. I drove while Raoul, next to me, was in a kind of sleep, half awake, half lost. The truck was big, sturdy, with a load of high-value electronic equipment. I knew the job was not easy, but I never imagined that something as common as this journey would turn into a nightmare. In the distance, on a wide curve, I saw what I didn't like from the first second. A pickup truck parked at the edge of the road, no lights on, no license plates visible, almost merged with the darkness of the storm. It was too still, too out of place. True, most vehicles stop for bad weather, for traffic, for some mishap on the road, but that van had no excuse for being there. I mentioned it quietly, but Raoul paid no attention. It made me feel silly for thinking it might be something else. Sometimes you get paranoid from exhaustion, from isolation. After all, the world doesn't stop for a storm. However, the feeling in my stomach did not leave me. That van, invisible and silent, was stalking me. As we kept going, the road began to get narrower. The rains came down harder, and visibility was reduced. And just when I thought my mind was playing tricks, I felt it in the air. Something was about to happen. It was like an instinct. I knew we were not alone on the road. Then, as if fate had made a signal, the van turned on its taillights and began to move. It was not a sudden start, but something calculated, almost imperceptible. The vehicle began to follow us closely, keeping a dangerous distance. My eyes widened, adrenaline surged immediately. Raoul, still sleepy, asked me if something was wrong. I told him no, but the uneasiness was palpable in my nerves. For a few kilometers, I tried to stay calm, making sure we were not being chased. But we weren't. Every time I accelerated, the van did the same. Every time I tried to slow down to analyze the situation, so did she. It was a game, one of patience, one in which I knew something was about to happen. My hands were starting to sweat. Fear was taking over me. I felt the first blow when the truck rammed us from the side. It was a dry, heavy impact that made me lose control for a second. The truck began to slide down the wet road, and the light from the truck's headlights almost blinded me as it continued to press on. Raoul screamed, but I was too focused on not rolling over. I accelerated hard, giving my best to the engine, but the van followed in our wake, unstoppable. I tried to maneuver to lose her in a curve, but there was no time. The noise of the impact was louder in the next collision, and the weight of the van pushed us to the side of the road. My heart was beating a mile a minute. Sweat covered my forehead and my mind was clouding. We had no plan. There was no way out. The only thing I knew was that van wasn't going to stop until it had us. The impact had left us reeling, but the truck was still standing, and that was all that mattered at that moment. However, the feeling of being stalked, watched, did not go away. The truck, which had originally been just a few feet behind us, was no longer in sight. It was a second of respite, of false calm. For a few moments, Raoul and I looked at each other in silence. He was pale, frightened, and I felt that fear had marked me, that I could not rest until I understood what the hell was going on. I accelerated again. I no longer cared about the speed limit. I needed to get off that road as soon as possible, and my only option was to get to the next intersection, where the lights of a gas station might be my only refuge. As I arrived, I glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping to see something that would give me certainty that we had escaped. But all I saw was darkness. The deepest terror was not in the taillights, but in the silence. There was no sign of the van. A few minutes passed and we moved on. We did not stop at the gas station. I could not trust any presence in that remote area, and Raoul, with his tense face, knew it too. I decided to change route, to take more secluded roads, looking for a way that would take us out of that damn journey. But something was still in the air. Something was not right. At that moment, the noise of the rain intensified again. The wind whipped the truck hard. The lights reflected like ghosts on the asphalt. The road became darker and lonelier. My mind kept thinking about the truck. Who were those people? Why were they chasing us? What did they want from us? Then, just when I thought we had escaped, just when calm seemed to be coming, I saw it. At the edge of a small intersection, almost lost in the shadows, was a parked pickup truck. This time the lights were visible, but they did not reflect the kind of tranquility one would expect from an ordinary vehicle. The van was a bad omen, and not just because of its presence, but because of the way it stood motionless, watching us. At that moment, I understood. The van had not followed us by accident. We were not the primary target of a random robbery. It was something more calculated, something much deeper. The moment we rounded the bend, the van accelerated and surrounded us. In its windows, I could see the faces of several people reflected. I couldn't see them clearly, but their silhouettes sent a wave of terror through me. They were waiting for us. Raoul didn't say a word. He knew it was too late. We were trapped. Behind us, more lights began to appear. They surrounded us. The previously empty road filled with vehicles, shadows, and unfamiliar figures. They knew we had been on the same road. They had planned every step, every turn. We were not just two drivers on a dark road. We were the pieces of a game we could not control. Worst of all, we didn't know what they wanted from us, what our cargo was worth. But that no longer mattered. We were on the fringes of something bigger, something that could not be seen, something that had begun long before we were there. The game was now clear. We were no longer the masters of our own lives. We had been surrounded. We had been caught in an invisible net that had left us with no way out. And as the sound of the rain mingled with the sounds of approaching engines, I realized that nothing in this world is as terrifying as the ability of other human beings to play with our lives, as if we were mere pawns on a board that was already marked. The only thing left for me was to try to get out of that damned game alive, knowing that the real threat is not always in what we see, but in what we cannot see, in the eyes that stalk us in the dark, waiting for the exact moment to strip us of everything we believe to be ours. The rain began to fall as I left the concert, a violent torrent that left no respite, and I was right at the entrance of the bus station, soaked to the bone. People around me were running around aimlessly, seeking shelter under bus shelters or in the small stores lining the street. I just wanted to get home. I had enjoyed the night more than I expected, but the reality of getting home has always been a deterrent, and now, with the water soaking my jacket and shoes, all I wanted was to escape the storm. I took the first bus I saw. It was half empty. Only a couple of other people got on before the doors closed, and the driver, without saying a word, started off and began the slow ride through the wet streets. I sat in a seat near the window, hoping that the rain wouldn't get worse and that I would soon reach my destination. I didn't realize it right away, but something in the air had changed. Maybe it was the strange silence of the bus, maybe the feeling that the atmosphere was charged with palpable tension, but something told me that it wasn't just the storm that was causing that pressure in my chest. The steady sound of the rain pattering against the metal roof of the vehicle, the low murmur of the windshield wipers working at full speed, became a sort of litany that lulled me to sleep as I tried to tune out the crowd, the thoughts roaming in my head, and the anxiety of the late hours. However, as I looked ahead, I noticed that the driver seemed to be in no hurry. At first I thought maybe it was due to the bad weather, reduced visibility, but as I moved forward, the feeling of discomfort grew. I was still in the urban area when the bus began to slow down for no apparent reason. We were barely moving. Some passengers were whispering to each other, but there was no real conversation. We were all too tired to talk, too absorbed in the tense calm that had settled over the vehicle. It was at that moment that I saw, at the end of the aisle, a couple of men climbing out of the back door of the bus. They looked no different from the others, but there was something about their movements that made me frown. The two men sat down, one near the door, and one in the seat across from me. Their presence did not alarm me at first. My only thought was that, with the weather so heavy and the hour late, people often do unthinkable things. But my intuition told me that something was not right, that this was no ordinary stop. Soon after, the bus took an unfamiliar route. We had already left the city center behind, and were now on a stretch of deserted streets, the industrial zone, the kind of place you almost never pass through at night. At that instant, the vehicle came to a screeching halt, and the internal light flickered before shutting off completely. The darkness was almost total, broken only by the faint flashes of the bus's headlights. The sound of raindrops intensified. The wind was whipping the windows hard, but the tension inside the bus did not come from the storm. It was the silence of the passengers, the eerie silence that made me look around, as if I already knew what was about to happen. There were no clear signs, There was nothing to alert me until the men stood up at the same time. One of them advanced towards the driver, while the other began to walk down the aisle with a firm step, his eyes fixed on each of the passengers. Suddenly, everything became clear. We were being assaulted. The man walking towards the passengers looked at me for a couple of seconds before reaching me, and it was in that instant when his gaze told me everything. There were no words, just an almost unbearable pressure in the air, as if he knew that, at that moment, each of us was just a piece in his game. I felt a pressure in my chest, an instinctive panic that made me swallow saliva with difficulty. The man came up to where I was sitting, and without a word, snatched the cell phone from my hands. I didn't even have time to react. The situation became even more tense when I heard the other passengers murmuring, some trying to negotiate, others too terrified to speak. The man in the aisle, after stealing my phone, began checking everyone else. The bus lights were still out, and the storm seemed to get worse with each passing minute. The rain, which had seemed calm before, was now pounding the roof of the bus with almost deafening force. As the other man continued to threaten the driver, asking him to open the back door, panic set in. I knew there was no way anyone could help us. The street was empty. The bus was an easy target. But the worst was yet to come. The man who had started to search the passengers didn't stop at personal items. He not only stole, but beat them if they didn't comply. Passengers who tried to resist received clear threats. I felt a strong blow on my shoulder when one of the passengers tried to defend his wallet. The blow was sharp, and the blood rushed to my head. I froze, not knowing what to do. At some point, when there was no more money or phones left on the bus, the men began shouting orders, but they were not mere words of intimidation. Their voices were raised, and something in their tones, something in their restrained fury, made me feel that we were not simply in a robbery situation. We were in a trap, a point of no return. The other passengers were no longer people who were simply robbed. They were victims, and their lives no longer had the same value to these men. It was when the back door of the bus opened and the cold, damp air rushed into the vehicle that I realized the storm was not the only thing that had changed that night. The men pushed the passengers out one by one. I knew what was going to happen. I felt it in every fiber of my being, but I couldn't move. It all happened too fast. People were pushed to the asphalt. Some fell. Others didn't even have time to react. The driver was as scared as the rest of us and did nothing to stop it. The door slammed shut, and the bus started up again, with a metallic sound that echoed in my ears. I looked out the window and saw how the lights of the bus illuminated the shadows of the empty street. The men hadn't wanted my life, but I can't say the same for the other passengers. And that's the part I can't stop remembering. The moment the bus light faded into the storm, leaving behind those who would never return home. The first thing I felt was a deep emptiness, as if everything I had gone through in my life had suddenly evaporated. I was there, sitting on that bus, my hands empty, my heart pounding in my chest, but the worst thing was the stillness of the moment. It wasn't just the fear, not just the terror of what was happening beyond my control. It was the certainty that nothing would be the same after that night. That bus, which had been my temporary refuge from the storm, had become a mobile prison, a scene of despair. I knew it when the doors closed with a dry sound, when the wheel of the vehicle turned, and in the blink of an eye, we found ourselves moving away from everything we knew, from the warm lights of the city and the daily routine that seemed so far away in that instant. The driver, at first visible in his seat, became increasingly nervous. His hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and it wasn't the cold of the storm that was making him hesitate. It was the pressure he was feeling, the same pressure that had reached all of us. The tension was palpable. As soon as the bus rounded a bend and began to take a darker road, my gut told me we were being taken to a place of no return. It all came down to a primal feeling, that of being trapped. The man at the back of the bus, the one who had been standing by the back door, was the first to move. His steps were calculated, slow, as if he was enjoying the suffering he was sowing among the passengers. His gaze did not stop scanning every face, every body, until his eyes were fixed on me, as if he recognized me. I stared at him, not knowing if I should do something or just stay still. A shiver ran down my back. The back door of the bus burst open, and in that instant, the cold storm air rushed in like a sharp razor. No one moved. Everyone waited for the man to say something, but he did not. The atmosphere was charged with tension, as if it was all a matter of time. Suddenly, without warning, the man in the aisle began to advance towards the passengers one by one. He took something from each one, a purse, a wallet, a cell phone. But the worst was not the robbery itself. The worst was the pain, the violence contained in his gestures, as if each of us had to pay the price for being there. Every blow, every push to the ground, every look of contempt they threw at each other felt like a condemnation. Then, everything accelerated. The second man, the one who had been next to the driver, also stood up and began shouting orders. The bus light flickered intermittently, creating strange shadows that slid along the metal walls of the vehicle. It was chaos, a nightmare made flesh, but the most terrifying thing was the way the other passengers reacted. Some tried to defend themselves. Others simply crouched down, fearful, hoping it would all be over soon. But it did not end. When the men started pushing people out of the bus, the situation became irreversible. The vehicle was no longer a simple means of transportation. It had become a kind of prison, and we were the pieces trapped inside. One by one, the passengers were thrown into the street, some falling hard, others not even having time to do anything. The screams and blows were confused with the sound of the rain, creating such absolute chaos that I felt unable to move, as if gravity itself had immobilized me. I was on the verge of despair. What could I do? I knew that my life was no longer worth anything to those men, that somehow I had already been marked as one of those who had to suffer. But the thought that others would not have the same fate filled me with dread. What started as a robbery was turning into a massacre, and at that moment, I understood that we were not only robbed of what we had, we were robbed of our dignity, our safety, and what is worse, we were robbed of the hope of getting out of there alive. My breathing quickened, my hands were sweating, and in a primitive impulse, I tried to move, to run, but my legs did not respond. The men had reached my seat. In the blink of an eye, the first of them lifted me by the shoulders and dragged me toward the back door. I don't know how, but somehow I managed to free myself from his grip. Maybe it was the confusion of the moment. Maybe the fatigue of the trip had given me some strength. But all I could do was run into the hallway, driven by the purest fear I had ever felt. What followed was a mixture of chaos and instinctive action. The bus door opened wide, letting in the rain and icy wind. The men weren't following me, but I couldn't stay there. I couldn't stay and wait for what could be the end of me. I ran down the hallway, lunged for the door, and with a desperate push, jumped out onto the wet street. The impact was strong. I fell to my knees, but I got up quickly, without looking back. The sound of the bus doors closing and the sound of the engines starting was all I heard before I was lost in the darkness. I ran aimlessly, thinking of nothing but escape, until my body collapsed from exhaustion. At that point, the storm didn't seem so terrifying. It was, yes, but not as scary as what I had left behind. I watched the bus drive away, headlights shining in the rain. I knew I would never see those passengers again. I had no idea what had happened to them, whether they were alive or dead, whether they had been left behind or whether the men had taken their lives as easily as they had taken their belongings. The fear did not go away. It never went away. And I don't know if it ever will. But what I do know is that I learned something that night that I will never forget. In the chaos, in the darkness, in those moments when it seems all is lost, we cannot always choose our fate. We are vulnerable. We are fragile. And when violence hits us, all we can do is run, hope, and pray for a miracle. I will never know how many died that night, but I couldn't help but think that we are all, at some point, susceptible to becoming victims of something much bigger than ourselves. Life is not always fair. Chance, violence, the decisions of a few can overturn the destiny of many. Sometimes, men do not need to be monsters to spread terror. The fear that surrounds us is more human than we think, and that is the most terrifying lesson of all. We never know when our last season will be.